Waking to Mr. Darcy. A Dash of Darcy and Companions Collection, Book 2. Written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, a cloned voice made available by the voice actor through the 11 Labs library. Chapter 1. Rude. Charles Bingley placed another piece of wood none too gently on the pile he and Fitzwilliam Darcy were making near the fireplace. "That is what my sisters are." Rude. He had been storming in and out of the hunting cabin for nearly 10 minutes, muttering under his breath until finally he could not keep his displeasure to himself and had begun to share it with Darcy. They were barely civil to Mrs. Bennet and spoke not a word to any of the Miss Bennets, except for Miss Elizabeth. He gave a harsh laugh. And they only spoke to her when absolutely necessary, and with such a superior air. He stomped out the door, to the woodpile, and back into the cabin. "I have a mind to send them both off with Hurst. Let him deal with them. Not that he would know much of what they were about, since he is constantly in his cups." Another log was forcefully stacked near the fireplace, and Bingley released a loud huff of frustration. Darcy closed the door and shrugged out of his overcoat. He knew that Bingley was enamoured with Jane Bennet. He was also aware that Bingley's sisters did not approve of the match, or the Bennets, for many of the same reasons he knew his own relations would not approve of them. "Have you considered that their lack of civility is not fully unwarranted?" he asked cautiously. "Out!" Bingley pointed to the door. "I've escaped to this cabin to be rid of such sentiments. You may go spread your vitriol with my sisters. Caroline would be delighted." Darcy winced at the thought of spending any amount of time with Caroline Bingley, and grimaced a second time as he realised that his friend was comparing him to that very lady. "Let me explain," he began. "I have no desire to hear about the Bennets being of low standing." Bingley knelt before the hearth, applying himself to the starting of a fire. The November evening air was cool and damp. "Mr. Bennet is a gentleman." He turned his head to look at Darcy. "A gentleman who was born that way." "He's married to trade," Darcy retorted. Bingley growled something at the tinder and was then silent. Darcy watched him work for a moment. When he was satisfied that the fire was about to start, he went in search of 2 cups and a bottle of brandy. "How many days' worth of supplies did you have them deliver?" he called to Bingley from the kitchen as he found what he sought. 5. Bingley took the bottle of brandy and doubled the amount Darcy had poured for him. "I'm not certain how long it will be before I am willing to see my sisters again." He peered over his cup with raised brows. "The same will be said for you if you continue with your disparagements of the Bennets. You're determined to marry her, are you?" Darcy joined his friend in reclining in the chairs in front of the fireplace. "I am." Bingley sat with legs extended toward the fire. "I love her." Darcy sighed. "You know so little about her. Are you sure that it is not just her beauty and pleasant manners which entice you and cause you to think that you're in love?" It would not be the first time his friend had thought himself in love when, in reality, it was mere infatuation that faded as quickly as it sprang up. "I know enough," Bingley answered, as he leaned forward, staring intently at the flames. "I have never been so consumed with a desire to be in anyone's presence." "That does not equate to love," Darcy muttered. Bingley shot him a sidelong glare. "Allow me to finish." Darcy nodded and motioned with his hand that Bingley should continue. "You know how you worry when a friend is ill?" he asked. "I do," Darcy said. "And you know how you worry when a dearly loved family member, such as a sister, cousin, father, or mother is ill?" Bingley continued. "I do." Darcy knew that both he and Bingley, having lost both parents, were well acquainted with that sort of worry. "You worry for a friend," Bingley explained, "but you move on with life, aiding where you can, visiting and inquiring, but never having your mind completely consumed with worry. Your work never stops. However, when it is a member of your family, focus on anything but his recovery is impossible. That depends on the friend or relation." For Bingley, Darcy would leave his business and sit by Bingley's side. For several of his relations, such as his Aunt Catherine, however, he would merely inquire after them and send his wishes for a speedy recovery. Bingley shrugged. "It might, but my point is the same. Your concern deepens proportionately to the amount of affection you have for the individual. Would you not agree?" Darcy wanted to refute the argument, for he knew exactly where it was headed, but he could not. What Bingley said was true. "Very well. You care for her deeply as you would a sister." Bingley laughed. "Not like a sister." Not even if mine were as lovely as Miss Bennet. I am quite certain a brother's thoughts should not run along the same line as mine have for her." Darcy chuckled. "I love her, Darcy. It will not fade when you return to town, and there is a new flock of debutantes, will it?" It was not the first time Bingley had declared himself in love, only to retract his declaration after a short period of time away from the lady, and being presented with new ladies to admire. Bingley shook his head. "I do not even wish to return to town." Darcy's eyebrows rose at that. Bingley enjoyed the activities of the season and forced Darcy to attend many more soirees than he wished. A wish not to return to town was a wish to forego the season. Perhaps his friend's feelings ran true, but that did not mean the lady returned them. "But what about Miss Bennet's feelings for you? I have not noticed any particular fondness on her part towards you." Bingley smiled into his drink. "You were not very attentive while she was at Netherfield, were you?" "I beg your pardon? I most certainly was attentive." Bingley laughed. "To Miss Elizabeth, perhaps, but not to me or Miss Bennet." Darcy scowled at Bingley. He had been distracted by Miss Elizabeth, that much was true, but he had also watched Miss Bennet and had not seen any indication of partiality toward Bingley. "Did you see her face light up when I carried her tray to her room?" "You know I did not, for I was not in her room." Bingley nodded in acceptance of Darcy's answer. "When she joined us in the evening, did you see her slip her hand into mine for a brief moment?" "She did no such thing," snapped Darcy. "I assure you she did," said Bingley with a smile. "Neither of those things indicates that I was inattentive," Darcy grumbled, "but they do prove you wrong." A smile of satisfaction spread across Bingley's face as he settled back into his chair. Darcy rolled his eyes. Why did so many find it so delightful to prove him wrong? He was about to say as much when a loud clap of thunder rattled the shutters, and rain began falling heavily against the roof. "I was right about that," muttered Darcy. "Large, ominous clouds and a brisk breeze make the prediction of a storm rather easy," Bingley refuted. Darcy shrugged and lapsed into silence. This morning he'd been considering trying to persuade his friend to return to London before the end of the month, but that seemed unlikely now. He bit his lip as he pondered his situation. He really could not afford to remain in Hertfordshire. First, there was the chance of meeting with George Wickham once again, and he was not certain he would be able to hold his tongue or keep his hands in good regulation at their next meeting. The man was, without a doubt, the most reprehensible of Darcy's acquaintance. Darcy sighed softly. There was also the danger to his heart, for he was entirely convinced that if he were to spend much more time in the delightful company of Miss Elizabeth Bennet, his heart would be completely and utterly lost. He peeked at Bingley, who was swirling his drink and smiling. Perhaps Bingley could afford a connection with one such as Miss Bennet, but Darcy could not. At least, he could not if he wished to keep peace within his family, and he prized peace. He tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair. What were his options? He could return to town without Bingley. He thought on that for a moment, and then, with the decision made, he lifted his glass and said, "I will need to return to town in a fortnight, since I cannot bring Georgiana to Netherfield as planned." Bingley, well aware of the way Wickham had preyed on Georgiana's sweet spirit in an attempt to win her dowry, nodded. "Will you return?" Darcy lifted one shoulder and let it drop. Georgiana might wish to return to Pem. His comment was interrupted by a loud pounding. Bingley jumped to his feet and rushed to the door. "What fool would be out in this weather?" he muttered as he swung the door open. "Oh, Mr. Bingley." Elizabeth Bennet stood on the doorstep, soaked from the rain and covered by a large amount of mud. "Miss Elizabeth, come in." He stepped to the side so that she could enter, but she stood as if rooted to her spot. "I fell." She brushed at the mud on her sleeve. She looked around for a moment as if not certain as to where she was. "Mr. Bingley?" "Come in," Bingley insisted once again. This time his entreaty was accompanied by Darcy's hand grasping Elizabeth by the elbow and moving her into the room. "I fell," she repeated. "Did you injure yourself?" Darcy slowly moved her toward the fire. "Mr. Darcy?" She looked at him as if she were not positive she had the name correct. Panic rose in Darcy's chest. "Did you hit your head?" Her brows furrowed as if trying to remember, and then she nodded as she began to sway. Darcy scooped her up. "A blanket for the couch," he barked to Bingley, "and then water and a cloth." He held Elizabeth as her eyes fluttered and closed. Her limbs became limp and lifeless. and he lowered his head near her lips to listen for breath. Relieved that she was still breathing, he settled her onto the couch as gently as he could before removing her bonnet and feeling her head as he checked it for injury. "There are no lumps on her head or signs of bleeding," he said to Bingley, as he sat back and looked at her. She nodded that she'd hit her head, but if it was not hard, then why did she faint? "The brain can be rattled without a lump forming," cautioned Bingley. Although Darcy knew this to be true, he was not satisfied that she had swooned because of an imperceivable bump to the head. There might be some other significant injury that had caused her to become insensible. "But could it be more?" Darcy asked as he lifted one of Elizabeth's arms and then the other. However, there were no signs of injury as each moved well. "Perhaps her leg could be injured," Bingley suggested. "That is quite a lot of mud." Bingley motioned to where Elizabeth's skirt seemed to be more covered in mud on the right side than on the left. "She was walking. How could her leg be injured if she was walking?" muttered Darcy, looking first at Elizabeth and then Bingley. "I suppose we must check." "Seems reasonable," agreed Bingley. Darcy looked at Elizabeth lying there, pale and beginning to tremble, a sign that her condition was not improving but growing more grave. They not only needed to discover any remaining injuries, but she needed to be made warm and dry. He knew what must be done. "Do you truly love Miss Bennet?" he asked Bingley. "I do," Bingley answered. "But what does that have to do with checking Miss Elizabeth's leg?" Darcy released a great breath. "She's beginning to tremble and must be gotten into dry things. I can check her leg at the same time. I will move her to my bedroom, and you may remain out here and bring what I need to the door." "You plan to undress and redress her?" Bingley's eyes were wide. "One of us must. And since you are determined to marry Miss Bennet, I shall tend to Miss Elizabeth and marry her, if her father requires it." "You think he will not?" The shock had not left Bingley's voice. Darcy shook his head. "No, I expect we will be brothers." He lifted Elizabeth gently and moved toward the small bedroom that was to be his while they were at the hunting cabin. "Bring the blanket, Bingley." "It is her left leg," said Bingley, showing Darcy the portion of the blanket that was stained by blood before he spread it on the bed. Darcy placed Elizabeth on the blanket and then rummaged through his bag for his sewing kit, in case the gash was severe and required closing, and a shirt that she could wear while her clothes were cleaned and dried. Finding what he needed, he called for Bingley to not only bring water and a towel, but to also bring the bottle of brandy. Then, pushing the door to, he apologised to Miss Elizabeth and began the task of removing her clothes, beginning with her half-boots, after removing only her boots and stockings. He placed them outside the door and waited for Bingley to arrive with the towel and brandy. He leaned against the closed door feeling rather unstable. The gash on her leg was jagged and ugly, and he had needed to tie a cravat around it to slow the bleeding until he could dress it properly, but the sight of the wound and the blood was not what had him unsteady. "You do not look well," said Bingley. Darcy smiled tightly. "Her mother is from trade, Bingley. My uncle will never approve." "She's injured, and she is both an intelligent and pretty woman," Bingley countered. Darcy nodded. Yes, I know." He took the towel and bottle of brandy from Bingley. "I've only removed her boots and stockings because I need you to hold her leg steady while I tend to the wound." "Of course," said Bingley, following him into the room. "Perhaps if she wakes while you're working, then she will be able to change the rest of her clothes on her own, and you will be spared from having to marry her." The thought brought both a glimmer of hope to Darcy's mind and a pain to his heart. He uncovered Elizabeth's left leg and removed the cravat. He watched her face for any signs of waking. Seeing none, he cleaned the wound and began closing it. His stitches were not pretty, for his hands shook as he sewed. She moaned and his stomach twisted. Her leg twitched and he swallowed in an attempt to steady both his nerves and his hand. He knew it was necessary to cause her such discomfort, but he could not be complacent about it. He tied a clean cravat around the closed wound and rubbed his forearm across his forehead, using his sleeve to remove the beads of sweat. "You do not look well," Bingley observed for the fourth time. "She did not wake. We could place her near the fire so that her dress would dry and then wrap her in blankets to warm her," Bingley suggested. "You know how damp chills," replied Darcy. "We may have waited too long as it is. I would be surprised if she did not develop a fever." He sighed. There was really no way around it. He was going to have to disappoint his family and marry her. Surely his uncle would understand the need to save a life. He bit his lip and shook his head. While his uncle might understand such reasoning and accept the marriage as necessary, his Aunt Catherine would not, She was not so sensible as her brother. "Warm more water, Bingley. I will change her, and then wash off whatever mud is on her person, although, I suspect, it is mainly on her clothing." Before Bingley could move away from the bed, Darcy grabbed him by the arm, and as much as I wish her to wake, pray she does not do so while I am disrobing her. Bingley chuckled. "That would be a trifle awkward." "Indeed," Darcy agreed flatly. "I'll leave you to it then," said Bingley, clapping Darcy on the shoulder and giving him a teasing smile. "She's fortunate it is you, and you are fortunate she is not my sister." Then, with a chuckle, he turned and left the room as Darcy apologised once more to Elizabeth and began the uncomfortable task of seeing her into dry clothes. Chapter 2. Darcy rolled the sleeves of his shirt, which were several inches too long, so that Elizabeth's hands were visible. He straightened the collar and pulled the bedclothes over her, making sure to place her hands and arms outside the quilt as he tucked it around her small frame. He brushed a stray strand of hair away from her pale face. She was still not warm, but she was clean and she was dry, and Darcy hoped that the two would be enough to stave off any fever. "I am sorry," he repeated yet again. How many times had he said those words? He felt as if he could never say them enough. If there had been any other way... He sighed. But there had not been any other way. "I shall be good to you," he promised as he gathered her clothes. "I am sorry," he whispered the words again before he exited the room. "You still do not look well," said Bingley from where he sat near the fire, "although you are not so pale as you were." He tipped his head. "In fact, you look rather flushed." Darcy chose not to acknowledge the comment, or the teasing tone in which it was said. He was feeling rather flummoxed. His heart had already begun to betray him before this evening, but now it seemed to have utterly abandoned all sense of reason. He pulled on his coat and turned toward the door. "Are you going for help?" Bingley asked as he jumped to his feet. Darcy shook his head. He needed air, and Elizabeth's clothes needed cleaning. "Heat some more water," he said, "and see if you can find a basin in which I might wash her clothes." "You are going to wash her clothing?" Bingley's eyes were wide. "She cannot put them back on as they are," Darcy answered. Bingley nodded thoughtfully, though it was evident from the look on his face that he had not considered the need. "I had thought her father would bring something for her to wear." "He may," Darcy said, "but if she wakes before he arrives, she cannot get out of bed." He intentionally looked away from Bingley as he said it. He could feel his face and ears growing warmer as he thought of why she could not get out of bed. His shirt was plenty large and hung to her knees, or nearly so, but the way it draped around her body and its ability to only mask what lay beneath made it far from decent. "She's not exactly dressed for company," he explained, as he pulled his hat down and Bingley chuckled softly. "I will rinse her clothes in the rain as best I can and then wash them in the water you prepare." He opened the door and stepped outside. Then he placed a bucket of rainwater inside the door and waited, while Bingley found a basin before emptying the water into a large pot for heating and returning the bucket to Darcy. Darcy tugged the door shut and returned the bucket to where it could collect water and be reached without venturing too far into the rain to retrieve it. Next, he placed Elizabeth's clothing on the portion of the wood pile that was exposed to the wind and rain, where the roof of the structure, built to keep the wood dry, was broken and partially missing. Bingley would need to fix that as soon as possible if he wished to have a place to escape his sister and enough wood to keep him warm and fed while hiding. Darcy rubbed the fabric of Elizabeth's stockings, trying to help the rain remove the stains of mud and blood. Then, setting them aside, he attended to her chemise and petticoat before working on her dress. Try as he might, he could not keep his mind from wandering to the wearer of the garments. "I have never wished to marry for convenience," he said as he stood back, sheltered from the rain and watching it fall onto Elizabeth's clothing. "Nor have I wished to be trapped." He leaned his head back against the structure and studied the jagged edge of wood where the roof opened to the dark evening sky and allowed the rain to pour through. He was certain Elizabeth wished for neither eventuality either, but wished for or not, a marriage was about to be forced upon them. His heart ached, not because he would have to marry Elizabeth. He had resigned himself to the fact, and his heart, betrayer that it was, would not allow him to regret it. However, it would allow him to feel the pain of having removed Elizabeth's choice. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the dress that lay on the wood. He gathered the full pail of water and took it to the door for Bingley before returning to his place, to once again watch the rain fall on her clothes, Bingley would be his brother, which was an advantage to the arrangement. However, he scowled and huffed. Bingley came with sisters, as did Miss Elizabeth. Jane was acceptable. He would not mind being part of any gathering which she chose to attend, but the rest of the Bennets, as well as Caroline and Louisa, he could do without. Not that avoidance of either set of relations would be possible, he supposed. Of course, being married would at least keep him out of Caroline's grasp, and since his estate was in Derbyshire, there was hope that travel might not suit Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Again his heart turned on him, and made him feel pained at the thought of separating Elizabeth from those she loved. He gathered her clothes, squeezed as much water out of them as he could, and returned to the warm, dry confines of the cottage. Then, after disposing of his coat and hat, he began the task of finishing the cleaning of the clothes. Bingley chuckled as he watched him. "I never imagined I would see you playing the part of a servant." Darcy was not finding the humour in their situation, as Bingley seemingly was. "Do you think me too good to do menial tasks?" he asked rather sharply. "Have you not seen me tend to my own things when we have been hunting? And I assure you there is much that I help with on my estate." Bingley chuckled again. "It is a different thing to see you tending to a dress." Darcy shook his head. "I have a sister." "As do I," said Bingley, "but neither of us does their laundry." Darcy shrugged. It was true. When Georgiana was young, he had brushed dirt from her skirt and kissed her forehead as he dried tears, but he had staff that tended to things beyond that. Until today he had never sewn flesh together, though he had seen it done, nor had he ever done the work of a lady's maid. His face grew warm again at the thought, and he rubbed the article of clothing he held more vigorously. Finally, when Elizabeth's clothes were as clean as he was going to get them, he hung them near the fireplace to dry, and then turned the chairs that he and Bingley had been occupying, so that their backs were to her things. "It seems wrong that we should stare at her clothing while it dries," he said softly in explanation, as Bingley returned from the kitchen with a plate of cheese, cold meat and bread. "I'm certain she would not approve," he added. Bingley agreed with him, and the two took their seats again. This time, however, Darcy had the greater share of brandy in his glass. They sat there for some time, eating and listening to the sound of the rain falling on the roof and the crackling of the fire. "You will not be able to get help tonight," Darcy said finally. "Perhaps in the morning." He rose from his chair, placed his glass on a table near the couch, and went to check on Elizabeth. Her cheeks were flushed, and before he had placed a hand on her forehead, he knew that she was feverish. He dipped a cloth in the water basin that remained in the room, and then placed the cool, damp cloth on her forehead. "Miss Elizabeth." He spoke as if she could hear him. His physician had always claimed that it might be possible for a person to hear, even when senseless, and Darcy, unwilling to challenge the notion to the detriment of the invalid, had subscribed to the practice. "Your clothes are drying nicely by the fire. I was not able to remove all the stains, but perhaps when you return home your servants will have better success than I. I'm not skilled in tending to laundry, I'm afraid." He drew a small wooden, straight-backed chair near her bed and sat for a few minutes. "Bingley will go for help in the morning. It is still raining, and travel would not be safe as the moon is hidden." He leaned forward, propping his chin on his hands as his elbows rested on his knees. "You will be well soon?" He hoped that she believed it. He was not certain he did, but his mood was rather dour, so things might not be so dreadful as he feared. After watching her sleep for a few moments and trying not to let his spirits become any lower, he removed the cloth from her forehead, rinsed it and replaced it. "I will return," he said before he exited the room, leaving the door fully open. "Help me carry this chair into her room," he said to Bingley, indicating the chair Darcy had reclined in before the fire. "She has a fever," he said in answer to Bingley's lifted brow. "I might get a bit more rest in this chair than in the wooden one in there." "If you are certain," said Bingley. "I am certain of very little," Darcy admitted. Instead of picking up his side of the chair as Darcy expected him to do, Bingley leaned on the back of the chair, impeding Darcy's progress. "You have done what was needed," Bingley said. "But she will hate me for it." Darcy smiled tightly at his friend. Bingley shrugged one shoulder and tilted his head. "She may for a while, but you are not without your charms." Darcy shook his head and rolled his eyes. "I do not have an ounce of charm." "Sit," said Bingley. "She will be well for a moment." Darcy eyed the chair and then the door to the bedroom. "Seriously, man, sit down," said Bingley. "I shall not help you move this chair until you do." "I see there is a bit of Caroline in you," grumbled Darcy with a smile as he took a seat. Bingley laughed. "Thankfully, only a bit." He paced in front of Darcy. "Tell me, why do you fear Miss Elizabeth's hatred?" With arms folded across his chest, he turned to face his friend. Darcy did not know what made him fear Elizabeth's displeasure so very much. It was, more than likely, his traitorous heart causing the confusion. While he was confident he did not yet love her, he was equally as certain that he cared for her. For he was never at ease when he made a friend unhappy. A stranger, a meddling relative, a business associate who refused to see reason. These he did not give two figs about if they were put out with him, but a friend? He shook his head. That was a different thing altogether. "I will tell you why," said Bingley, dropping into his chair. "It will unsettle your very organised and orchestrated life. You will finally be doing what you wish in breaking that sham of an engagement to your cousin. Your uncle will finally stop badgering you about doing your duty, and your sister will have a sister that will do her good. Not to mention, my sister will at last be put in her place instead of being drawn along by your dashed proper gentlemanliness." He chuckled. "Oh, it will bring some raised voices and censure, perhaps, but in the end it will bring happiness. How could it not? You have been smitten with her since after that assembly." "Happy with a woman who hates me for forcing her into marriage?" Darcy scoffed. "It matters not what I feel for her if she despises me. In fact, should I fancy her above all others, that shall only make my misery that much greater when my affections are not returned. And then there is the matter of her relations." Bingley cleared his throat and glared at him. "They are boisterous. You know how I do not like cacophonous gatherings, and what else shall they be?" He blew out a breath. "And I shall be removing her from them. While I might not appreciate them, I am sure she loves them." He stood. "It is no good. You have tried, but I will not be appeased until I have her forgiveness." "Only hers?" Bingley's left eyebrow rose slightly, and his lips curled in a hint of a smile. "Yes." "Do you not desire your relations' forgiveness?" Bingley steepled his fingers in front of his chest. Darcy blinked in surprise at the question. No, he did not desire his relations' forgiveness. In fact, he had not even thought to seek it. He only truly cared for their acceptance. Of her. "And what of her father?" asked Bingley. "I'm certain her mother will not require any apology, seeing as you have 10,000 a year." The smirk on his face grew as he said the last bit in a high, ladylike voice. Darcy chuckled. How could he not at the ridiculous sound? "I suppose I would wish for his forgiveness." "But it is her forgiveness, above all others, that you seek?" Bingley asked. "Yes." He rolled his eyes at the smug look on Bingley's face. "I admit I care for her as I would care for any friend." "Of course." Bingley stood and took his place at the chair to help move it. "However, I believe it is something a bit deeper." He held up a hand to forestall the denial Darcy was about to give. "Do not give me some lecture on love. We both know I am more well versed in matters of the heart than you are, although I have only recently discovered what it is to be truly in love." "Yes, about that," said Darcy, taking small shuffling steps and glancing over his shoulder to see his way. "Are you sure it is not infatuation?" "Do not begin again with me, Darcy. I've already told you that it is not, and her connections are improving. I hear her sister is to marry a wealthy gentleman with an uncle who is an earl." "An earl?" Again he adopted the high ladylike voice. "Shh!" cautioned Darcy with a grin. "She is sleeping." As quietly as possible, they placed the chair near Elizabeth's bed. Then, after obtaining an assurance from Darcy that he would call for assistance if needed, Bingley left the room. "I shall be keeping you company tonight," Darcy said to Elizabeth as he changed the cloth on her forehead and made note of how warm her skin felt. Then he settled into the chair and rested his head against the wide wing and added, "Please poke me if I begin to snore." Chapter 3. Darcy slept in fits as best he could through the night, waking now and again to check on Elizabeth and change the cloth on her forehead. When the first rays of morning were attempting to push their way through the clouds that refused to disperse, Bingley rose, made tea, and ensured that Darcy had both tea and something to eat before donning his coat and hat and heading out into the rain. Darcy paced the cabin for a bit, allowing his legs to feel the pleasantness of movement after sitting for so long. He gathered Elizabeth's clothes, which were dry, folded them and placed them next to his own things in the wardrobe in the bedroom. Then, With book in hand, he returned to his position of watchfulness at her side. She was still warm, but not frightfully so. The fever did not seem to be rampant. He lifted the blanket from her leg and checked her injury. Satisfied that it was doing well, he opened his book and began to read. The words travelled through his mind, one after the other, but none of them made a morsel of sense. He reread the passage, but still the words held no meaning. He placed the book on the table near the bed. Perhaps he would try again later. With reading being struck from the list of possible occupations, he sought for something else to do to help fill his time. His eyes kept returning to the wardrobe. Finally, his mind grasped upon an idea. Her stocking needed repair. He was not proficient with a needle and thread, but he was not without some skill. If it turned out that she needed to wear them home, she might appreciate that the one not have a large hole in it. So, he gathered what he needed and set to the task of repairing the damage her fall had done to the item of clothing. He was just tying off his work when she moaned softly and rolled to her side, facing away from him. She drew her knees upward and hissed. Darcy's heart beat rapidly in his chest. He was happy that she was beginning to stir, but he was also nervous about her reaction to finding herself here, with him. He put his needle away and, folding her stocking, returned it to the wardrobe. "Mr. Darcy?" He turned to see Elizabeth rubbing her eyes and looking at him in confusion. "Good morning, Miss Elizabeth." "Why are you here?" she asked as she attempted to sit up. "Please, stay lying down," insisted Darcy. "You're not yet well." He took his seat near her once again. "Do you remember falling?" he asked, watching her eyes closely to see if they would look distant or focused. She nodded her head and winced. "So you did injure your head," he said with a small smile. "I did not feel any lumps. Where exactly does it hurt?" She still wore a look of confusion, but her eyes were focused. "Here," she said as she placed a hand on the right side of her head. "I stumbled and hit my head on a tree, which caused me to lose my footing altogether." "And when you fell, is that when you cut your leg?" he asked. She blinked. "Yes. There were some branches near where I fell. One of them caught my leg." She moved her left leg slightly. "It is very sore." "It was no mere scratch," said Darcy. "It took several stitches to close it." He gave her a reassuring smile. "I am afraid my needlework is not as fine as yours would be, but it has managed to hold the wound closed." She began to sit once again. You stitched my leg." He helped her to sit, drawing a pillow up to rest behind her back. "I would prefer that you remain lying down," he murmured. "You're still slightly feverish and should not do anything to worsen it." Elizabeth would have taken exception to his comments if it had not been for the tender tone of concern with which they were delivered. She placed a hand on the sore spot on her head. Her brain must be thoroughly addled if she was attributing such sentiments to the dour and disapproving Mr. Darcy. The movement caused her to take note of the garment she was wearing. Her eyes grew wide. "What am I wearing?" Darcy grimaced. His heart began to beat a rapid rhythm. "We must talk, but I'm not certain you're well enough yet." She peeked beneath her covers. It did not feel like she was wearing her clothes, but for some reason her mind would not believe it without proof. She sucked in a quick breath as she realized that she was not wrong. She was wearing a shirt, and it appeared that she was wearing only a shirt. She drew the blankets up to her neck and held them there. "Whose shirt am I wearing? And where are my clothes?" The panic that Darcy saw in her eyes reflected that which he felt in his stomach. Perhaps Mr. Darcy was right. She should have stayed lying down. She rested her head back against the headboard of the bed and closed her eyes against the spinning of the room. Perhaps when she opened them again, this confusing dream would be gone. She peeked one eye open and closed it again. Mr. Darcy was still there, looking just as uneasy as she felt. This was not a dream. "My clothes?" she whispered, daring to open her eyes and peer at him. He ran a finger around the collar of his shirt as if needing to loosen a cravat, but as Elizabeth finally noticed, he was not wearing one. In fact, he was rather dishevelled. He was not wearing a jacket, his shirt was opened slightly at the neck, and his sleeves were rolled up to nearly his elbows. She closed her eyes again. "Your things are in the wardrobe. They're cleaned as best I could manage and dried. As soon as you feel well enough, you may put them back on. I just finished mending your torn stocking." His hand motioned awkwardly toward the wardrobe. She was not even watching. Why was he gesturing? He shook his head. He was not good at conversations with ladies in general, but a conversation with a lady whom he'd compromised, and whom he was about to tell must marry him. Well, that was going to try his abilities further than they had ever before been tested. Her eyes flew open, and her lashes fluttered in disbelief. "You mended my stocking?" Darcy nodded, as a lump formed in his throat. Perhaps it would grow so large that it would choke off his ability to babble, but it did not, at least not before he could add one more thought regarding her stocking. "You will no doubt wish to remove the stitches and do it properly, but it is wearable." He was certain she did not care about the quality of his handiwork. She was more than likely mortified that he had seen or touched her stockings. His cheeks were beginning to flush, and he desperately wished to leave the room. But he would not flee the inevitable. She would eventually know all. It might as well be now. "The shirt you are wearing is mine." He dropped his gaze and winced at the strangled gasping sound from Elizabeth. She would hate him for this, just as he had told Bingley. "You should lie down," he suggested. "The stress of these events cannot be good for you. We can discuss our marriage later." And with that, he rose and did just as he had told himself he would not do. He fled the room. Elizabeth watched him leave. She was wearing his shirt. He had tended to her clothing. He had stitched her stocking and her leg. It really was more than she thought she could countenance. She closed her eyes again, but this time she did not just close them against the spinning of the room, but also against his words. Marriage. To a man who despised her, and whom she despised in return? Tears slid down her cheeks. She brushed them away and flipped the blankets back so that she could see the gash on her leg. She peeked under the cloth that was tied around it. It was fairly neatly closed, but red and angry. As she tucked her leg back under the blankets, she noted the basin of water and cloth sitting next to the bed on the nightstand. Had Mr. Darcy also tended to her fever? She placed a hand on her forehead. It did feel warm. Her fever. Mr. Darcy's care, being here, dressed as she was. It was all too confusing, but confusing or not? Whether the room was spinning or not, she needed to attend to a few things while he was out of the room. A few minutes later, after having tended to her needs and satisfying her curiosity by looking at her clothing in the wardrobe, she tucked herself back into bed. Her head and leg throbbed and her limbs felt weak. It had perhaps been too much activity to attempt on her own, but she had no maid and was unwilling to let him assist her. She would be well with some rest, she told herself. The room would stop spinning and her strength would return. She settled back on her pillow and closed her eyes. Darcy stood outside the door to the bedroom and heard her limp across the room. He held his breath as she latched the door. He listened to the wardrobe opening and various other sounds of things moving. Then, after some minutes, when the latch once again slid on the door, he let out a great breath and went to fetch tea. She needed something to help her body regain strength. Elizabeth brushed away another tear. She attempted to steel her nerves as she heard him approach the room. Whatever discussion must follow his return, she would face it with courage. "Some tea with a bit of honey. No milk," he said as he placed a cup on the table next to the bed. "Are you able to manage it yourself?" She nodded. "Thank you." She took a sip. "It is just how I like it." "Yes, I know. It is how you took it while at Netherfield." He retrieved the chamber pot and left the room. Elizabeth groaned. He had not only seen her fully unclothed, but now he was tending to that. It was obviously not possible to die of mortification, or she would have been dead twice over now. So while allowing herself to feel the humiliation and still breathe, she sipped her tea and waited for him to rejoin her. "Please." She motioned to the chair when he returned. "I shall get a cup," he said with a nod. As he stood in the kitchen with kettle in hand, he considered putting it back and filling his cup with brandy instead, but he did not. However, he did not hurry in his preparation of his tea. "Do not say anything ungentlemanly," he cautioned himself before returning to the room. When he had returned, Elizabeth waited for him to take a seat and a sip of his tea before she took a breath and broached the topic of her current situation. "I remember Mr. Bingley opening the door, but nothing after that," she admitted. She had been trying to recall what had happened. There was the stumble, the fall, the wandering toward a cabin, Mr. Bingley, and then blackness. Mr. Darcy took another swallow of his tea. "You swooned shortly thereafter." Another swallow of tea. "I caught you." She covered a yawn with her hand. "You should rest," he said. We can discuss this later. She shook her head. I will not rest well without knowing. I fear you may not rest well even after you know, he said. It was strange to her how he found the contents of his teacup so interesting at that moment. Was he truly fearful of her response? But I must know, she said softly, before stifling another yawn. He nodded his agreement and peeked up at her. You swooned. So I laid you on the couch and examined your head for an injury. There was none that was perceivable. Your arm seemed fine as well, so Bingley suggested that perhaps it was your leg. I thought that strange since you had been walking, but I agreed that we must check. The contents of his cup had become once more of great interest. His discomfort in speaking was readily apparent to Elizabeth, and she felt a small tug of something at her heart. You had begun to tremble at that time, he said. I knew that if you were to remain in cold, wet clothes, the results could be grave. Another swallow of tea and more study of his cup followed the comment. We discovered that your leg was bleeding when we moved you to this room. Did both of you tend to me? He shook his head. No. He glanced up at her. Bingley loves Jane. It was a puzzling statement, but she smiled nonetheless. She had thought Mr. Bingley partial to her sister, and what needed to be done was— He stopped as if lost about how to proceed. You were wet and cold and injured. She nodded. And I was not in love with your sister. Again she nodded. Darcy knew his brain and mouth were beginning their trek down a dangerous path of babbling. Forgive me, I shall probably not express myself well. He took a final swallow of tea. I thought it best that I put myself in the position of having to marry you. What father would not insist that a man who did what I was about to do marry his daughter? What did you do? Elizabeth's cheeks burned with embarrassment, imagining what it was that he had done. I removed your boots and stockings and then realized that I would need Bingley to assist me, to hold your leg still as I fixed it. He stood and paced. Then I undressed you, cleaned off whatever mud there was on your person, and put my shirt on you. He stood with his back towards her. I am sorry, but it was necessary. He glanced at her once before moving toward the door. You should rest. Wait, she called to him. Is that all that has happened? Not that it is not enough. He turned. You became feverish. I sat with you all night, and then, after Bingley had left this morning to go for help, you awoke. There is no more to tell. So you volunteered to tend to me because Mr. Bingley wishes to marry my sister? He nodded, and then shook his head as he attempted to explain himself. You needed someone to care for you, and I would never leave a friend to suffer a dire fate if I could, in any way, prevent it. Never. There was something odd about the tone in which she asked the question, but not fully trusting his ability to accurately discern anything at the moment, he assured her that he would never abandon a friend. Then, with an apology and an insistence that she needed rest, and that she only needed to call if he was needed, he once again fled the room. Chapter 4. Time stretched on, one long quiet minute after another. Elizabeth shifted in her bed, attempting to get comfortable. The pain in her head and leg made the task somewhat difficult, but her mind made it nearly impossible. Mrs. Darcy. Those words echoed in her mind over and over. She was to be married to the man she despised. There was no hope of avoiding that fact. She was alone with him in a cabin somewhere near Netherfield, dressed only in his shirt, which he had put on her. She closed her eyes in mortification. How was she to accept such a fate? How was she to accept such a man? She drew in a deep breath and released it slowly. Perhaps after a good rest her head would not hurt as much, and the spinning would stop, and then, possibly then, she would be able to reconcile herself to her fate. Eventually she drifted into a state of half-wakefulness. Her mind refused to stop its work, but her body was equally as eager to find rest. The card party at her Aunt Phillips's house played in her mind. The tables all neatly and cosily arranged, the excitement of Lydia at having won a bet, the droning of her cousin attempting to fill the room with praises of his patroness, and Wickham. Even in her state of semi-awareness she smiled at the name. His description of the weather had been most pleasant. An unusual occurrence for normally such small talk was dull. However, his ability with words had made it delightful. She almost wished for the rain as he spoke of it. Ah, the rain. She would listen to that. Perhaps it would drown out her ruminations and allow for sleep. For a time it worked. Her mind relaxed. She thought about nothing but the constant dripping and tapping of the rain. And then, just as she was about to drift into a dream, Wickham's voice returned, but not as it had been before. This time, as the dream took it, the words twisted and turned, converging with those of her sisters. "I have no right to give my opinion," Wickham smiled. "He is correct," Jane said from the corner. "He has positively no right on such a short acquaintance to speak to you of such things. Do not listen." "I've known him too long and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial," Wickham continued. "He speaks truth again," Jane whispered in her ear. "His words are partial. He tells what he believes to be true, but it is only his view. The window might be cloudy." Play continued around them, but did not include them. They sat as ghosts unseen by the others. The world is blinded by his fortune and consequence, or frightened by his high and imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen. Wickham cocked his head to the side and placed a hand on Elizabeth's. "He's trying to draw you in," Jane's whisper was sharp, and she drew Elizabeth's hand out from under Wickham's. "He wishes you to see him only as he wishes to be seen, and he only wishes you to see Mr. Darcy as he wishes you to see the man. Do not listen any longer." "He has treated me ill," continued Wickham, "which I cannot but attribute in some measure to jealousy." "Oh, he is right once again." Jane moved between Elizabeth and Wickham. "Jealousy is definitely at play, but who is the more jealous remains to be seen. Come away with me, dear sister." Wickham's eyes filled with sorrow, but Elizabeth could not tell if it was genuinely felt or feigned. "I would never dishonour his father, but to him I cannot be just." "He is not just." Jane's hands cupped Elizabeth's face. "He is not just. Mr. Darcy is good. Mr. Bingley is his friend, so how could he be anything less than good? Be reasonable, Elizabeth. Come away with me. We have had enough of this man's charming words." Wickham pushed Jane to the side with a wink and a smile. "Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be a conversable companion if he thinks it worth his while. Among those who are at all his equals in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. Dear sister, take care. Remember what you have seen of Mr. Darcy. Remember how he acted at Netherfield. Consider how he acted just now. Is this the man Mr. Wickham describes?" She pulled at Elizabeth's arm to draw her away. "Do not judge a man based solely on the words of another man who shares such secrets when you have only just met. Be wise. Consider. Judge for yourself. Come away." "I will," murmured Elizabeth as the images faded into the mist of sleep. Darcy tapped lightly on Elizabeth's door before opening it slowly and peering in to see if she was awake. She was not, but he entered anyway. He had slept for a short time on the couch, but his eyes still burned and his body ached for more rest. However, despite the demands of his tired body, he wished to see that she was indeed well, and had not suddenly taken a turn for the worse. He knew in his mind that such worries were foolish, but his traitorous heart would not allow him to push them aside. He stood next to her bed. She looked peaceful. Her cheeks were not so flushed as they had been. He gently rested his hand on her forehead. She was still warm. He sat in the chair and watched her. Her well-being would be his responsibility now. Unable to stop himself, he touched her cheek. She turned towards him. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and a smile formed on her lips. He sucked in a breath as he waited for her to recognize that it was him, and for the beautiful expression she wore to fade as realization dawned. However, to his delight, her eyes opened, and her smile remained. One of her eyebrows arched. "You are a most attentive physician, Mr. Darcy." Her tone was light. "I worry," he muttered, slightly unsettled by her teasing. "Have I passed your examination?" She moved to sit up, and immediately he was there to assist. "I only wished to see if your fever had increased. It has not." "That is good," Elizabeth commented. "But you should be aware that there is a slight scratchiness to my throat." "I will get you some tea." He moved to leave. "Not just yet." She rested her hand on his. "We will speak for a while, and then when you need to remove yourself from the conversation, or I need you to be removed, you may get me some tea." He blinked. She understood his unease? Very few did. "Of what shall we speak?" he asked. Elizabeth pondered the question. There was much she wanted to know. Indeed, much she needed to know. "You." I would like to speak about you." Her heart thudded against her ribs. He settled into his chair. "Very well. What shall I tell you about me?" She studied him. He was relaxed to a degree, but there was still a rigidness to his shoulders, and the fingers of his left hand tapped the side of his leg. She smiled. "I know you're from Derbyshire. In fact, I've heard it told that you own half of it." "My estate is extensive," he said. "It has much land and many tenants, and the house is larger than Netherfield. It is well tended and profitable. You shall want for nothing." "I was not inquiring in regards to myself," she said. Her smile had faded, and he grimaced. "I apologize. I did not mean to offend. I can tell you of my tenants and my fields, if you prefer, or of the house itself. I also have a house in town in Grosvenor Square." He shook his head. "I only wish to assure you that marriage to me would not be without benefit." He grimaced again. "That was not well said either." He blew out a breath. "I shall no doubt offend with my comments, but I would rather you be aware of what lies ahead and be prepared, than enter into our marriage blindly." Elizabeth took note of how he shifted slightly, and all but one of his fingers stopped their nervous tapping of his leg. She had thought that speaking of himself might put him at ease, but it was apparent she was quite incorrect about that. "To say my estate is half of Derbyshire is not an exaggeration. I am responsible for a great many things and a great many people. If I do not do well, neither do they. It is not a responsibility I take lightly, and I would expect my wife to show an equal amount of care for her duties to the estate and our home in town." He held up the finger that had been tapping his leg. "Not that I think you would not give such things their due, but it is a new situation in which you'll find yourself. It is not Longbourn." She nodded, unsure if she should be offended at his comments or not. It stung to have her abilities doubted, and she wished to tell him that she was prepared to run any household he might have. However, he had said it was larger than Netherfield, and although she was positive she could manage Netherfield, she was uncertain if she could manage something far more grand. "My uncle, you may be aware, is an earl. I have heard that detail. Your aunt is my cousin, Mr. Collins's patroness." She waited, fearful of what his response to such a connection would be. His eyebrows rose. "Lady Catherine?" She nodded. "He was recently given the living at Hunsford." "And your cousin? It is he who visits you now?" "It is." "And he has told you of Lady Catherine?" "In great detail," she smiled. "My cousin is not a man of few words or paltry praises. He has, I would suspect, given her even greater homage than she is due. He is quite insufferable." Darcy chuckled. "Indeed?" "Quite. It was his presence that drove me out of doors when rain threatened." "He speaks so much." "Far more than you might imagine, and about the most ridiculous things." Elizabeth smoothed the blanket over her legs. "He has come to Longbourn at your aunt's request to find a wife among his cousins. It appeared as if he'd selected me, and since I feared that staying too long in the house with him might give him a chance to propose, I fled to the woods." "You do not wish to marry him?" Darcy asked. "Most decidedly I do not," she shuddered. "I cannot even bear a few moments of his babblings without wishing to do him harm. I should never survive a marriage." She shuddered again. And Darcy chuckled again. "Or he would not." Elizabeth laughed. "There is that too. He was capable of jokes. That was something in his favour." "Since you have mentioned her," Darcy began, "I must speak to you of my aunt and my uncle." "The Earl?" He nodded. "Your mother is from trade. They will take note of that fact. My uncle I expect to be more tolerant of it, but Lady Catherine will be—" He paused, and though a host of colourful descriptions passed through his mind, he did not employ them for fear of being offensive, so he simply added, "Less so." His eyes held hers, his gaze was most intent, and she understood that what he had said was done carefully. "Will she be outraged?" she asked quietly. "It is not an unusual state for my aunt." Elizabeth's eyes grew wide as she remembered something Wickham had said. "You cannot marry me." His brows furrowed. "I believe I must." She shook her head. "You cannot, for you are promised to your cousin." "Did your cousin tell you this?" He tried to keep the anger from his voice, but from her response he knew he'd not been successful. "No," her reply was barely above a whisper. "Then who?" Bingley knew of his aunt's desires, as did Caroline, but would they have told her? Perhaps Caroline might. "Mr. Wickham." Her reply arrested his thoughts and his breath. She watched his jaw muscle clench and relax. clench and relax as his face took on a look of great displeasure. "My Aunt Phillips had a gathering, and he was there," she explained. "And he spoke of me and my affairs." His tone, he knew, was harsh. She nodded. "And you listened?" She could not look at him. He was furious. "I am sorry," she whispered. He rose. "I will get tea. Please do not be too long out of bed doing whatever you might need to do. You're still not well." He stopped as he reached the door. "Mr. Wickham's lot is of his own making, and it is far better than he deserves." He opened the door. "I will return," he said as he took his leave of the room. Tears ran down her cheeks as he closed the door. She brushed them away. Foolish things, tears, always appearing unbidden. It was not as if they could actually wash away her shame. She climbed out of bed and attended to her needs. Then, feeling somewhat stronger than she had before, she wandered the room for a few short circuits before returning to bed. Her stomach twisted in knots as she waited for him to return. It was not a short wait. Darcy did not hurry with his tea preparations. He needed time to calm himself. Nearly a full quarter-hour of moving wood outside the door, under the shelter, was needed before he felt ready to begin a task as genteel as tea preparation. He searched through the supplies and found a box of biscuits. Elizabeth might need more than just tea. She seemed to be doing better. "Wickham," he spat the name at the tea tray. "Always Wickham." He leaned his head against the wall as he waited for the water to boil. "Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth stood at the door to the kitchen with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I must apologize." "You are not to be out of bed." He took her by the shoulders, turned her, and directed her back towards her room. "I will get the tea, and then you may talk." "I must apologize," she insisted as she limped along ahead of him. "I knew it was wrong to listen. I did not inquire about anything from him, but I also did not stop him from speaking. I did not want to stop him." Darcy froze at the comment, and Elizabeth, who was just outside the bedroom, turned to him. "I wish to hear him disparage you. I know it is wrong, and I am so very sorry." Tears once again tried to wash away her shame and sorrow. She swayed slightly. "You must get in bed." She took a wobbly step, but before she could take a second, he had lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. "Please, stay here," he said softly. She grasped his sleeve. "I am so very sorry." He nodded, gave her a tight smile as he pressed his handkerchief into her hand, and once again left the room. Chapter 5. When Darcy finally entered her room with the tea tray, Elizabeth was sitting on the edge of the bed, preparing to stand. Seeing him, she hurried to climb back under the covers. He lifted a brow and sat the tea tray on the table, taking care to keep his eyes on the tray and not her. His shirt did little to conceal what lay beneath. "Were you coming to find me again?" He waited until she was comfortably ensconced in her blankets before handing her a cup of tea. "You are not a very good patient." He held out the plate of biscuits. "I've never been a very good patient or student, I'm afraid. I'm far too impatient." She took a small bite of her biscuit, followed by a sip of tea. "You make a very good cup of tea, sir." He inclined his head in acceptance of her compliment. Both were silent while they ate and drank, neither willing, it seemed, to broach the subject that was on their minds. Finally, Elizabeth handed her cup to Darcy and began the discussion that needed to be had. "I must explain my dreadful behaviour." She peeked up from studying the handkerchief she wound between her fingers. "I assure you that I've been taught proper social graces. Perhaps not so well as your sister, but well enough to know that encouraging gossip and sharing with others is wrong." Her eyes returned to watching the handkerchief thread, under one finger and over the next. "I shared what I had eagerly listened to with my sister Jane, and she reminded me that I should take care in listening to such things. She's very nearly always right." She sighed. "I have been thinking this past half-hour about what I heard, and I must admit, had I been less eager to hear ill, I would have questioned some things before now." Darcy placed his cup next to hers on the tray. "Perhaps you could share with me what you have heard, so that I might defend myself against the charges." She swallowed. His eyes were hard and his tone was severe. Still she nodded and began. For several minutes she related all that she had heard of Wickham's connections, his mistreatment, and his knowledge of Darcy's engagement. She finished with his description of Miss Darcy. It was something she could not do without a few tears falling, for she could see how deeply her words affected Mr. Darcy. She knew that if she were to be subjected to hearing such things said about a family member, She would be both angry and hurt. When she'd finished speaking, Darcy rose and paced the room. It was not any less than he had expected Wickham to share with an eager listener. Although he found Wickham's description of his sister to be infuriating, he was glad that nothing more damaging had been said. Elizabeth watched him pace, his hands clenched and relaxed. He shook his head and seemingly remonstrated himself silently. Then he took a place near the room's small window and drew in what she hoped was a deep, calming breath. "Why did you wish to hear me disparaged?" He glanced her direction. "I had thought that we had formed a sort of friendship while you were at Netherfield." Her brows furrowed. He had counted her a friend? "I thought you disapproved of me. Did you not only look at me to find fault?" "Why should I do that?" His look of surprise matched hers. "Because my family is of no significance. My mother is loud, as are Lydia and Kitty, and, well, I am only tolerable at best." He grimaced as she continued. "We are fortunate to have Jane to do us credit, and I believe you shall be happy to be free of this area, as the people here are truly beneath your notice." She watched his face as she spoke. "Do you deny it, sir?" He shook his head. "Have I truly been so abominable?" She shrugged. "Not if you were to speak to Jane, but there are many others who would say you have been." "Such as yourself?" She nodded. "Your words about me were not exactly flattering." "I did not want to come to Hertfordshire," he said as he returned to his chair, "but Bingley had found an estate, and I had promised him my assistance." He smiled ruefully. "A Darcy does not go back on his word. That is what my father always said. So I came, but not willingly." She returned his smile and said, "That was apparent." He chuckled. "My sister has not been well. She has recently been through a trying experience, and I was loath to leave her." "I am sorry to hear that she is not well," Elizabeth said softly. He took a deep breath and released it in a whoosh. "We are to be married, so you should know the whole of the matter." "But what of your cousin?" "There is no understanding between myself and Anne," he answered. "It is her mother's desire that we marry, but it is not mine. I have yearly attempted to disabuse Lady Catherine of the thought, but she holds to it firmly." "You are truly not bound to your cousin?" Elizabeth was strangely happy to hear it. He shook his head. "I am not. However, I must caution you that my aunt will act as if you and I have done her daughter a grievous wrong. She will no doubt claim you have trapped me." He smiled. "And she is not always the most sensible of women." He leaned toward her and held her gaze with his own, which was brimming over with gravity. "Mr. Wickham is aware that there is no understanding between Anne and me. He's well versed in spinning a tale with just enough truth to make it seem credible." He stood and took another turn of the room. As he did, he began to relate to her the whole of his acquaintance with Wickham, from their friendship as children to their growing apart as Darcy's father began to show preference to Wickham, to their time at university, when Wickham's lack of morals and integrity became painfully clear. He left nothing out. He told her of the deaths of both his own father and Wickham's. He explained how the living had been refused, and how a settlement had been made in place of it, a settlement that was quickly wasted. Then he told of Wickham's returning to claim the living he had refused. With each detail, Elizabeth's stomach turned and her sense of shame deepened. Darcy reclaimed his seat beside her. "Perhaps that is enough for now." "Do you mean to say that there is more?" How could there be more? The list of grievances against Wickham was extensive. "Unfortunately, there is." He placed a hand on her cheek. "You should rest." She shook her head as tears pricked at her eyes. He was so gentle, so caring. How could he be so when she'd given him no reason to be? She had abused him to her sister, and had eagerly listened to tales about him. He was not the man she'd supposed him to be. "I will not rest until I know all." He chuckled and brushed a tear from her cheek. "You will no doubt come find me if I leave you." She smiled. "I will." He drew and released a breath that made his shoulders rise and fall noticeably, while he nodded slowly, as if resigning himself to do something he did not wish to do. "I must warn you," he said, "this part of the tale is the worst." Elizabeth's eyes grew wide and she sucked in her lower lip as she nodded her understanding. He'd already told her of Wickham's love of gambling, drinking, and many women. What could be worse? "My sister has £30,000 set aside as her marriage portion." Elizabeth gasped not only at the size of Miss Darcy's worth, but also at what she knew must follow such an introduction. "He attempted to get it?" Darcy nodded. "He did." Elizabeth sank back against her pillows, her eyes closed and a hand rested on her heart. How foolish I have been. His hand closed over hers. Mr. Wickham is proficient at his game. She looked at his hand and blushed. He mumbled an apology and removed his hand from hers. Why was he so tempted to touch her? To embrace her? To see her well, no matter what she had done? He relaxed into his chair, and after receiving an assurance of secrecy from her, he told her about how his sister had been charmed by Wickham and convinced that she was in love with him to the point of agreeing to an elopement. Fortunately, he concluded, the scheme was discovered before any permanent damage occurred, though I fear her heart may never be as it once was. Elizabeth could find no words to express all that she felt. There was shame, to be sure. To have been taken in by a pleasant countenance and pleasing words was mortifying. But there was also a deep sadness, a pain that threatened to crush her heart when she thought about what Miss Darcy must have experienced. To be tricked in such a way. It is why I had no desire to leave her, he said softly. It does not excuse my actions, of course, but I do hope it helps you understand them. Oh, cried Elizabeth, and then to see him here, in this place? It is no wonder you greeted him as you did. I can have Bingley assure you of much of what I've told you. He was not witness to Wickham's actions, but he has heard much from my cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, on the subject. Why would I need confirmation? Elizabeth asked in surprise. It is only my tale, he answered, and it does not agree with Mr. Wickham's. How are you to judge the veracity of either without evidence? There is evidence enough, she retorted. You have not flattered yourself, and what brother would tell such a tale about his sister unless it were true? She coughed lightly into the handkerchief she still held. It was beginning to feel as if a feather was tickling her throat and leaving little scratches in its wake. You should rest. He placed a hand on her forehead. Your cheeks are flushed and you are still warm. The fever is not gone and should not be stirred up any further. She coughed again. He tipped his head. I think we might have something to soothe that, he said with a small smile. I will go get it and a bit of water for you. Will you stay here? She nodded. Good. He stood and taking up the tea tray turned to leave. Mr. Darcy, she called after him. He turned toward her. Do you forgive me for my foolishness in listening to Mr. Wickham? He smiled. Can you forgive me for my words from our first meeting? A smile played at her lips as relief flooded her heart. Yes, I believe I can. Then we shall begin anew, he said, wiser for our foibles. Elizabeth watched him leave. He appeared different to her. His shoulders were not so rigid, and there was a certain softness to his movements that had not been there before. Mr. Wickham's words came once again to her mind. Among those who are at all his equals in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. She shook her head. She had not changed in consequence. She was now, as she always was, the daughter of a gentleman who, though of good standing in Hertfordshire, was far less prosperous than Mr. Darcy. Her mother had not changed, nor had her aunts and uncles. They were still from trade, and yet Mr. Darcy seemed at ease with her now. It appeared that she had breached the wall and entered the circle of those with whom he felt comfortable. She smiled and shook her head again. To think that being the friend of Mr. Darcy suddenly pleased her so. It was, she knew, due to her growing understanding of him. He was not as she had contrived. It was on his character and reviewing his actions in this new light of understanding that she was still thinking when he returned. First, a bit of warm water, he said as he held a cup out to her. He waited for her to sip from the cup and then, taking the cup from her and setting it aside, he scooped a spoonful of honey from the jar he carried. Mrs. Reynolds would sometimes mix in some herbs or lemon, but the honey is what coats and soothes, he explained, and it is rather tasty. He was correct. It was deliciously sweet, and Elizabeth licked the remaining honey from the spoon before returning it to him. Now, rest. His tone was very much that of a caretaker who would brook no objections. She relaxed back onto her pillows. Darcy settled into the chair with his book. Shall I read? He asked. He waited for a nod from his patient and then began. His voice was pleasant and the poetry good. Soon, Elizabeth found her eyes refusing to stay open. Her tired, sore muscles relaxed, and sleep began to overtake her senses. As she drifted to the edge of consciousness, his voice quieted. He placed a hand on her forehead, as he had done several times, to check her fever. Then, soft as a rose petal, he kissed the spot where his hand had lain. He watched her chest rise and fall in the easy rhythm of sleep. "Why do you affect me as you do?" he whispered. "It is beyond your beauty, for you move me to my very soul." He kissed her forehead once again, and added a soft, "Rest well," and as he returned to his chair to continue his reading silently, she did. Chapter 6. "Through that door," said Bingley, shaking the rain off his hat and pointing Mr. Bennet and Jane in the direction of the bedroom Elizabeth occupied. "I shall join you as soon as the kettle is on the flame." Mr. Bennet, with Jane by his side, hurried to the door indicated and pushed it open. "Well, that is a pretty picture," Mr. Bennet chuckled. Darcy had fallen asleep in his chair next to Elizabeth. Mr. Bingley was not wrong in Mr. Darcy's attentiveness, was he? I never thought to see Mr. Darcy playing the part of a nursemaid. "Papa," chided Jane, "he has saved her. You must not tease him for doing so." "Perhaps you are correct." Mr. Bennet walked to the chair and took the book from Darcy's hands. He has good taste in poetry." He peeked over the book at Jane. "Not that I thought him capable of poor taste." The noise and having his book taken from his hands roused Darcy. He straightened himself as quickly as he could when he realized he was not alone. "It is quite all right, my son." Mr. Bennet was studying Elizabeth's face. "We have all fallen asleep while reading at one point or another." He turned to Mr. Darcy. "Her cheeks are slightly flushed. Has she woken at all?" "Yes, sir, not long after Bingley left. Her fever has not grown worse, but it has not subsided either. She has not complained about her leg, but she has started to cough." He nodded a greeting to Jane, who had placed herself on the bed next to her sister. "Have you brought the surgeon, or apothecary?" "The surgeon is on his way," Mr. Bennet answered. "Young Thomas James fell, slipped on a wet stone, I hear, and the lad's arm needs setting. Mr. Shepherd will be along after he has completed that call. I was assured that my Lizzie was in good hands." He smiled at Darcy and motioned to the door. "I think we can leave her to Jane now, while we talk." "Papa? Jane?" Elizabeth rubbed the sleep from her eyes. "Ah, my daughter, it is good to see you." Mr. Bennet took her hand and gave it a kiss. "Your mother worried all night that a wild animal had devoured you. She was quite relieved to learn that you were alive." There was a banging of the door in the other room and a hurrying of feet toward them. "Oh, Cousin Elizabeth, you are well!" "Collins," growled Mr. Bennet, "why are you here?" "Mr. Darcy!" Collins took Darcy's hand, though it had not been extended, and bowed deeply. "It is an honour to meet you, sir, my patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh speaks very highly of you." Mr. Bennet sighed loudly. There was no mistaking his annoyance at the arrival of Mr. Collins. "Mr. Darcy," he said, "this fellow is my cousin, Mr. Collins." Darcy withdrew his hand from Mr. Collins' grasp. The very square shoulders had returned, and gone was the pleasant look to his face. The change saddened Elizabeth, but she could not fault him. Mr. Collins had that effect on most people who possessed any degree of sense. "Shall we move to the other room and allow the ladies some privacy?" Mr. Bennet put a firm hand on Mr. Collins' shoulder and moved him toward the door. "It is highly improper for you to be in here, sir." Darcy was somewhat startled by Mr. Bennet's stern tone. He had not thought him entirely capable of being firm. "But I have to see my dearest cousin. I was so very worried that she might be grievously ill." Reluctantly, and at Mr. Bennet's insistence, he moved towards the door to the room. "I am glad to see you are well," he called to Elizabeth. "I have something to say to you." Mr. Bennet gave the gentleman a push to remove him completely from the room. "You have nothing to say to my daughter," he said. "Oh, but I do. Her mother has a message for her." Collins pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "See, here it is. Well wishes, I assume." Mr. Bennet took it from him. "I shall see that she gets it if I decide the contents are such that she needs to see them." He tucked the note into his pocket. "But, sir, I was tasked most specifically with giving that to her. I would be sorely grieved to have not completed the service for which I was enlisted." Mr. Bennet ignored the comment and looked past Mr. Collins to where Mr. Bingley stood in the middle of the common room. "Ah, Mr. Bingley, has the water boiled?" he asked. "I do not know," Bingley replied. "I would imagine it is nearly boiled, but not yet." "Good," said Mr. Bennet. "Collins, are you capable of making a pot of tea?" "Oh, I most certainly am. Why, just the week before I travelled to Hertfordshire to visit my dear cousins, Lady Catherine called at the parsonage, and for one reason or another I was left to the task of making the tea. Now, Lady Catherine was beside herself with indignation on my behalf that I should have to perform such a task, but she was quite pleased with the results, and Lady Catherine does not give praise where it is not due, so I can with some assurance tell you that I shall be able to make you an acceptable pot of tea. Indeed, Lady Catherine will be pleased to know I could be of service to Mr. Darcy. Here he bowed once more. As I told her then and will reiterate when I relate this tale to her, God surely had his reasons for my having to make the tea, and so it now seems it was so that I might make it now for you and give you such assurance as I have given. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet spoke before the man could continue on his ramble, the water will be boiled away if you do not attend to it soon, and then what would you have to say to Lady Catherine? No doubt her ladyship would be sorely displeased. Shock suffused Mr. Collins' face, and Darcy nearly laughed at the speed with which the man scurried from the room. "Insufferable dolt," muttered Mr. Bennet. "I do apologise. I believe my wife has been scheming." He pulled the note from his pocket and unfolded it. It was as he thought, for on it was written, "Lizzie, if Mr. Darcy does not want you, as I am assured he will not, Mr. Collins will forgive you your circumstances. Accept him, and all will be well. Your embarrassment shall be forgotten, and your reputation saved." Mr. Bennet tore the paper once and then again before tossing the pieces into the fire. "Mr. Darcy, I am given to understand you cared for my daughter." Darcy gave a sharp nod. "I did. I apologise for my abruptness, but my cousin may appear at any moment. I hope you understand." He smiled as Darcy nodded again. "Did your care extend to her clothing?" Darcy's heart pounded within his chest. What he had been done for Elizabeth's benefit, yet he could not imagine how he might view a man who had rendered the same service to his sister. "Yes, sir. All of them." Mr. Bennet's voice was soft but serious. Darcy swallowed. "Yes, sir. Mr. Bingley assures me that you are prepared to offer for her." Another swallow. "Yes, I am." Mr. Bennet sat in the chair that faced the couch on which Darcy and Bingley sat. He leaned back and studied Darcy for a moment. "Why should I allow you to marry my daughter?" Darcy blinked. "Aside from saving her reputation?" Mr. Bennet nodded. "Yes, aside from that, and keep in mind that I'm well aware of your ability to provide for her." Darcy understood what the gentleman was asking, and it pleased him to know that Elizabeth's father, though perhaps negligent in some regards, was interested in the sort of man to whom he would entrust his daughter. "You wish to know of my character?" Darcy asked. Mr. Bennet tapped his nose. "I hear such differing accounts of it that I should like to hear your opinion." He glanced toward the kitchen, "although a thorough discussion might have to wait until I can rid us of an annoyance." Darcy smiled at Mr. Bennet's reference to his cousin. From his earlier conversation with Elizabeth, Darcy knew the sorts of accounts the man might have heard. There was no point in denying his weaknesses, as several had been on display since his arrival in Hertfordshire, and so he began here. "Very well. I shall be as succinct as possible. I'm given to thinking well of myself. I'm not always the most long-suffering of men. I do not yell or abuse, but I do get sullen and withdraw. My temper has been described as implacable, and my good opinion, once lost, is lost forever." He watched the surprise on Mr. Bennet's face grow with each comment. "I say all this to assure you that I am neither a man without fault nor a man who is unaware of them." At that moment, the conversation was intruded upon in a fashion that was not pleasing to any gathered, save the intruder. Mr. Collins appeared, carrying a tea-tray and rattling on about the trays of delights he'd taken part of at Rosings, which, Darcy suspected, would have taken a turn to a lofty description of the parlours. All of them, with each being given more than its share of praise, had Mr. Bennet not intervened. "The rain has slowed," he said, looking pointedly at Mr. Collins. "It might be best if you were to take advantage of the lull and return to Longbourn. It would not do for you to become ill, and I am confident that Lady Catherine would be most displeased if I did not caution you most strongly about seeing to your well-being." For a moment, it looked as if Mr. Collins might take Mr. Bennet's advice, but alas, it was not to be. "You are quite right about her ladyship's desire to see me well. I have had her instruction on it daily, all very worthy advice, and I do attempt to follow it as closely as I can. However, I shall have to wait until the next reprieve, for I really must speak with Cousin Elizabeth. Her ladyship demands it." He paused to take a sip of his tea. How exactly does my aunt demand you speak to your cousin when she is not here?" Catching the widening of Mr. Bennet's eyes, Darcy knew instantly that he would regret his inquiry. "Ah!" Mr. Collins took another sip of his tea and with a smack of his lips at the end set his cup aside. "Lady Catherine has made it clear to me that a parson is much better received and looked to for advice if he's married." A lump settled in Darcy's stomach. Surely this insipid man did not mean to ask Elizabeth to marry him. Darcy had not been in the man's presence for long, but he knew that Mr. Collins was not Elizabeth's equal in any way. Mr. Collins was large and lumbering where Elizabeth was slight and rather fleet of foot. Mr. Collins was too preoccupied with paying homage to devote any time to serious thought on anything else, while Elizabeth thought deeply on a great many subjects. It was a match which to Darcy was in all ways reprehensible. Elizabeth was worthy of a greater situation than that of a parson's wife, and at Rosings no less. He had seen the books, he knew precisely how much the parson made and what were his provisions. He also knew his aunt's tendency to economise for everyone that served her. "You see," Mr. Collins was continuing, "there has been a crack in our family history for some years now, and when her ladyship heard of it, she was incensed that I should allow it to remain as it was. She was most insistent that I take appropriate steps to repair the breach." Mr. Collins picked up his cup and lifted it to his lips. What he had intended to be a sip became more of a slurp, and with no little amount of embarrassment, he apologised several times before returning to his explanation. "Her ladyship most wisely saw that both my need of a wife and the healing of my family's distress could be met in one action. Therefore, I am come to Hertfordshire to select a wife from my cousins. It will be a most advantageous match, for I hope I do not offend, but their portion is not large, and I shall one day, in the distant future." Here he cast a look to Mr. Bennet that bespoke more compassion than Darcy expected the man was entirely capable of. "I shall then become the master of Longbourn and be able to care for those who might be left behind and in need. A wife from some other corner might not be so willing for me to keep my relations, you see." He took a small quiet sip of his tea. "Quite wise," he muttered, "quite wise." "And you have selected Miss Elizabeth?" Darcy asked. Mr. Bennet sputtered on his tea at the question. "Oh, indeed," said Mr. Collins. "I had wished to secure Cousin Jane, but her mother was kind enough to inform me that Cousin Jane's eye had turned elsewhere, and was hopeful of a good result. So, most naturally, I settled on the second daughter, whom her mother has assured me will make an excellent addition to the parsonage. Well-spoken, capable, all that." "And what will you do if Miss Elizabeth will not have you?" Darcy asked. His frustration with the talkative, unthinking clod was growing rapidly. "Oh, I have no doubt of her assurance." "Indeed," said Mr. Bennet in surprise. "I expect you shall be disappointed." Mr. Collins looked at Mr. Bennet as if his cousin was slow of understanding. "Who else will have her? She has spent a night in a cabin with 2 gentlemen and no chaperone. Once it is known, she shall have no other options, and one knows such stories cannot be kept silent for long in a village of any size, and I find Meryton particularly rich with gossips. I really must speak to the parson about it. He must not be doing his utmost." "Indeed," Darcy's tone was a bit of a growl. There seemed to be no end to the gentleman's audacity, to speak of the lady he wished to marry in such a fashion. "Indeed, you are correct. Elizabeth has spent the night in this cabin," he motioned to the bedroom door, "in my bed." He allowed the words to hang in the air for a moment as once again Mr. Bennet sputtered on his tea. "I do think that places the duty of marrying Miss Elizabeth squarely at my feet, sir." Mr. Collins's eyes grew as wide as Darcy had ever seen. "But you cannot," he said at last. "You're already betrothed. Her ladyship has had me prepare the service." "I am not betrothed, but her ladyship assures me you are." Mr. Collins sat straighter in his chair and lifted his chin as if taking umbrage at the insult to his patroness. "My aunt is wrong," Darcy said, "for I have made no offer of marriage to any lady." Mr. Collins' chin lifted even higher, so that he had to look down his nose at Darcy. "That cannot be." "Lady Catherine has told me how it was arranged since you were young. It is the great desire of both she and your late mother. I cannot imagine a man as honourable as yourself turning his back on his family's expectations for some country miss who is below your standing." Mr. Bennet made a move as if he were about to speak, but Darcy held up a hand and gave him a smile. "Please, allow me." Receiving Mr. Bennet's nod and a wave to continue, Darcy turned back to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, I do not know how you came by your degree, sir, for you seem incapable of producing a sound thought. Firstly, I will reiterate that I am not now, nor have I ever been, betrothed to my cousin Anne. Secondly, choosing a potential wife should be done with more care than selecting your trousers. One does not simply walk into a house and pick a wife from among the ladies of the home. You must get to know them, which will require you to stop speaking for several minutes in a row, a feat that I am not currently certain you could accomplish. If you had taken the time to become familiar with Miss Elizabeth, you would have realized that she would make a deplorable parson's wife. He turned to Mr. Bennet. "Forgive me," he said with a small smile. "I do not mean this as a disparagement." Mr. Bennet nodded. "Miss Elizabeth is headstrong and will not be the biddable wife that my aunt would prefer you to have. There would be many arguments, from which I believe my aunt would come away very unhappy, having been put rightly and properly in her place. Now, where was I in my enumerations?" "You were at thirdly," supplied Bingley. "Miss Bennet." "Thank you. Thirdly, to speak of the desires of a lady like Miss Bennet in securing a match is most indelicate." He gave Bingley a smile. "Particularly when the object of her affection is in your presence." "Quite so." Bingley folded his arms across his chest, looking quite pleased. "And most importantly, you have spoken meanly of a person for whom I care deeply. Miss Elizabeth is not a country miss of low standing, nor does she possess any lack of character, as your comments about her spending time here have suggested. She is in fact a gentleman's daughter of impeccable quality, and I've come to count her as a friend and with permission hope to make her my wife. I will not tolerate any disparagement of her. Not now, not ever." Darcy stood. "However, it is not for us to decide whom Miss Elizabeth should marry. I do believe that is her decision. Is it not, Mr. Bennet?" Mr. Bennet blinked and rose to stand next to Darcy. "Most certainly," he said. "However, she must choose one of you, for I am convinced that her reputation, no matter how upstanding she has been, would not survive the gossips." He turned to Mr. Collins. "Our vicar does not need your suggestions. You will keep them to yourself." Mr. Collins nodded. "Come now," said Mr. Bennet. "Let us see my Lizzie and hear her decision." "But she is ill," protested Mr. Collins. "Is she too ill to know her own mind?" Mr. Bennet looked to Darcy. "I do not believe she is." Darcy's concern for Elizabeth must have shone on his face, for her father winked at him and said, "She will be well. The surgeon will be here soon." Chapter 7. Elizabeth sat, propped up by pillows, in the bed. Gone was Mr. Darcy's shirt, and in its place was a proper night rail and dressing gown that Jane had brought from home. Jane had also brushed and braided her hair. Therefore, when the door to her room opened, she was feeling much more like receiving guests than she had before. If her leg would stop aching and her throat stop its tickling, she might even find the ordeal enjoyable. But she did not, especially when her cousin was among the people who entered. She smiled at her father and Mr. Darcy, gave a bow of her head to her cousin, and finally smiled at Mr. Bingley in greeting. "I must thank you for retrieving my sister and father, Mr. Bingley." "It was my pleasure," he said with assurance, and a decidedly happy smile as his gaze shifted from Elizabeth to a blushing Jane. According to Jane, Mr. Bingley's visit to Longbourn had been very productive. He had sealed himself away with Mr. Bennet in the study for a lengthy time. First, to tell their father of what had happened to Elizabeth without the complete house knowing the details, and then, since he was already speaking of offers of marriage, to request to make one of his own. He had, and Jane had accepted with alacrity. "Now we shall never be parted for long," Jane had said, "for Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy are such great friends that we shall often find ourselves together." The knowledge of this fact did help Elizabeth in facing what she knew would be the results of her father's learning of her accident and Mr. Darcy's care. Yet there was still a fluttering of unease in the pit of her stomach that greeted what she assumed would be the discussion of that very topic. Perhaps it would not be so very unsettling to discuss if Mr. Collins were not there, looking at her with his curious eyes and a look of pious superiority, as if his presence was something to be desired. It had made her shudder when she first met him, just as it did now. Mr. Bennet crossed to the chair next to his daughter's bed. "How are you feeling, my dear?" "Tired," she answered honestly. "My leg is sore, my head still aches, and my throat is in need of some tea and honey." "Ah, but," her father said, Are you feeling so poorly as to not be capable of having a discussion of a serious nature?" She had known this discussion was coming, and yet the mention of it caused her to swallow and her eyes to dart to Mr. Darcy. He looked as uneasy as she felt. It was really quite remarkable, for it was an expression she'd not seen on his face since those first few moments when she had first woken. The man whom she'd supposed to be always composed and assured of himself had twice now looked very uncertain of his reception. "No, I am not so tired or unwell to be incapable of that," she said softly, as her gaze dropped to look at the hand Jane held. "That is excellent." Mr. Bennet reclined in the chair as if perfectly at ease. It was an action that allowed Elizabeth to breathe more easily. He was not angry. "I shall not wander around the woods, Elizabeth. You know it is not my way." Elizabeth nodded. "You shall have to marry." Again she nodded. It was what she expected. It was what she had been preparing her mind to accept. "And it seems that you have two options." Elizabeth turned wide eyes to her father. She had not expected that. Surely he was not suggesting her cousin as an option. "I have my preference, of course," said her father, "but it is your decision as to what shall be." How could he smile if he was about to say what she dreaded he would? "Mr. Collins has nobly volunteered to take Mr. Darcy's place in marrying you." She watched his eyes twinkle and the corner of his mouth twitch and breathed a sigh of relief. "However," her father continued, "Mr. Darcy is not inclined to accept this offer unless it is what you would want." His brow rose and his lips pursed slightly, letting her know that he was struggling to keep his opinions to himself. She smiled and was rewarded with one in return. "And what does each gentleman have to offer?" she asked, while keeping her smile hidden from her face but not her eyes. Darcy was taken aback by the question for a moment, until he saw one of her eyebrows arch. She was being impertinent. He hoped it was to Mr. Collins's detriment, and not his own. "Well," Mr. Bennet tipped his head to the side, "Mr. Collins will, one day, on my demise, inherit Longbourn, and until then he can offer you the position of a parson's wife. It is a decent living, and his patroness is very condescending, although I am given to believe she is also rather exacting. However, Kent is not so very far from Hertfordshire, so visiting your sisters or having them visit you would not be a great inconvenience. Perhaps there are some fine gentlemen in Kent who might take a liking to one of them." "Papa," Jane whispered. Mr. Bennet leaned forward and patted Jane's knee. "I'm not anxious to part with any of you, but it must be done eventually." "Is that all?" Elizabeth asked. "Is there nothing more my cousin may offer? A comfortable income and a home, is that not enough?" Mr. Collins's tone was incredulous. "No, it is not. I wish for more," replied Elizabeth, favouring him with a smile that she did not feel. "What more can there be?" Mr. Collins cried. "A lady need only be kept in peace and provided for, to be thought of as respectable, and to be looked up to in her circles." Elizabeth watched Darcy's jaw clench and his eyes narrow. Apparently he did not agree with Mr. Collins. "Respect for one," she said. There were many things that she wished for in a husband, and though she had only ever shared such thoughts with Jane, the way Mr. Collins' nose jutted upward, coupled with the smug look on his face, was enough to goad her into sharing them here. "Affection for another," she continued. "He must be a man of good character with a heart that is loyal and strong. I wish for a man who will provide not only for me, but also for our children, and not just by providing wealth and comfort, but by also providing an example to be followed." She paused for a moment. "And to all this he must add a love of reading and debate." A rather inelegant snort escaped Mr. Collins. "I assure you I can offer all that." "Then, pray tell, what was the last book on philosophy or the most recent novel that you have read?" Elizabeth knew full well the man's thoughts on such subjects. He had, in his meandering speeches and lectures in the short time he had been at Longbourn, made his position on such things perfectly clear. A proper lady does not read such things. His nose etched ever so slightly higher. Sermons, books on etiquette and social graces are acceptable, nay, recommended. A lady must strengthen her mind in such things as to keep herself from sin, and to read anything else would necessarily tempt her to impropriety. A woman's mind is a fragile thing, easily led and in need of guidance. Any man of good character would know such and see to it that his wife and daughters read nothing that might harm them. Elizabeth caught her tongue between her front teeth. He really was a most arrogant bore. and I see no reason for a wife to care about her husband's ability to debate," he continued. "Debating is for the learned and scholarly man. It has very little place in the parlour amongst the ladies. No man wishes for a brawling wife. Indeed, it is his duty to instruct her to be otherwise. A quarrelsome woman is not a proper reflection on a man." Mr. Bennet coughed, and Elizabeth was nearly certain it was an attempt to cover a chuckle. He knew what she did. She and Mr. Collins were a most ill-matched pairing. "Quarrelling and debating are not the same things," Darcy grumbled. "Quite right, Mr. Darcy," said Elizabeth with a smile. She paused for a moment and tilted her head as she looked at him. A rather pleasant fluttering of excitement started in her stomach and spread through her chest and arms before causing her head to spin slightly. "I cannot think of a single true gentleman who would accept such vulgar activities from his wife," Mr. Collins declared, with no small amount of indignation. Elizabeth's smile grew as she said, "I can." "Surely you cannot. There is no such man in existence." Elizabeth's cheeks flushed, and she looked to her father, who was smiling in his "I see you have come to agree with me at last" fashion. Normally it was a look that drove her to throwing up her hands and stomping from the room, but today it did not. He gave her a nod, urging her to speak her mind. She took a deep breath and complied. "You are wrong, Mr. Collins." Her father gave her a smile and a wink, indicating it was just what he had hoped she would say. She gave her head a small shake and turned toward Mr. Collins. The man was gaping at her and sputtering about how it was impossible for him to be wrong, or for her to know that he was, or some such foolishness to which Elizabeth refused to listen. "You are wrong," she restated more firmly. "I'm certain there are such men who exist. I'm sure I have never met such a creature. I'm confident that you are mistaken, dear cousin. You have had a rather nasty fall, and you are not capable of—" "Do not accuse my daughter of being incapable of thought," growled Mr. Bennet. "I will endure most of your foolish ramblings and archaic ideas, but I will not allow you to insult my daughters." Mr. Collins shrank back slightly, muttering something about never insulting his fair cousin in such a way, but Elizabeth's father ignored him and spoke to Elizabeth instead. "Do you wish for me to tell you what Mr. Darcy has to offer, my dear?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Mr. Darcy has told me about his estate." Her heart thumped loudly in her chest. "His actions have told me the rest." She swallowed and squeezed Jane's hand. "He is not as I first thought." She peeked up at her father and then turned her eyes to her cousin. "You see, Mr. Collins, I know there are men who are as I described because Mr. Darcy is one." "Does this mean that you have made your choice?" her father asked. Elizabeth shook her head and chuckled. "No, Papa, I did not make this choice. A downpour of rain and a spot of mud made it for me." Her father joined her in chuckling. "Mr. Darcy," he said as he rose, and extended his hand to the gentleman, "I shall be pleased to know my daughter is in the care of a gentleman of such exceptional character." Darcy grasped Mr. Bennet's hand. Relief swept through his body until a troubling thought stopped it. "But, sir, I did not finish telling you of my character. You told me your failings which spoke to your strengths, and then your actions in defending my daughter and your friend before we entered this room told me the rest." A knock sounded at the door to the cottage, and Bingley hurried to answer it. "Ah, that must be Mr. Shepherd. Come, Mr. Darcy, we shall retire to the comfort of the fire while the surgeon examines your handiwork. And Mr. Collins, I believe you have accomplished your purpose, and seeing as the rain has not yet increased, you will want to hurry to Longbourn before it does." He took Mr. Collins by the arm and escorted him from the room as he sputtered about wishing to give a report to Mrs. Bennet about what the surgeon said. "No, no, Mr. Collins, you can see she's well. Truly you must not wait any longer to inform my wife of her good fortune in having a daughter spoken for by such a wealthy gentleman." "But Mr. Bennet," pleaded Mr. Collins, "he is not free to marry, and my patroness expects me to marry Miss Elizabeth in his place. In fact, I'm quite confident it will give her no end of pleasure to know that I have rescued my cousin from disrepute." "Rescued from disrepute?" Mr. Bennet's hand tightened on Mr. Collins' arm. "What have you done?" "I thought it a good thing to tell my patroness of what had happened to my cousin, as I was certain she would wish to know the character of the lady I had chosen. I assured her of Cousin Elizabeth's character in a most strongly worded way, mentioning, of course, how such an incident could happen to anyone." His brows drew together. She will not be pleased to hear that Cousin Elizabeth was walking when rain was threatening, but I did not mention that she was walking alone. That might have been too much for Lady Catherine to accept. However, she will be delighted to know her nephew has been of service in saving my cousin from a dire fate." "Stop," said Mr. Bennet. "Do you mean to tell me that you have written of this incident to Lady Catherine?" "Oh yes, without delay. I told myself that she should be informed right away, for to hear of it from any other source would be very displeasing. So, to that end, I wrote to her this morning while Mr. Bingley was still in conference with you." He nodded his head emphatically as he spoke. "I'm certain Lady Catherine will be accepting of Cousin Elizabeth, despite the improprieties of walking in the rain and injuring herself." "Elizabeth has refused you," Mr. Bennet spoke the words slowly as a man struggling to contain his anger might. "And had she not refused you, I would have. Go to Longbourn, pack your things and be gone. I cannot abide your father, and though I have tried, I cannot abide you." He grabbed Mr. Collins's hat and coat, shoved them at the man and opened the door. "Wait until morning if you must, but I have no desire to see you again." Mr. Bennet pushed the door closed as Mr. Collins still stood on the step, attempting to explain that he could not return to Rosings without a wife, and that Lady Catherine would be expecting him to have married Elizabeth. "I pity the woman that marries that man," Mr. Bennet muttered, and then sighed loudly. "I do hope my wife leaves off with her matchmaking for our daughters and that fool. I shall not allow any of them to marry him." With Mr. Collins gone and the surgeon examining Elizabeth, the 3 remaining gentlemen settled into seats in front of the fire to wait. It was not a long wait. The surgeon was pleased with the care that Elizabeth had received. He noted no significant issues that should be a cause for concern. Her wound should heal, both her cough and her fever should respond to proper rest, and the bump that she had received on her head showed no signs of having caused any lingering damage. With a promise to call again in 3 days' time, he left. "It appears that you may return home," Mr. Bennet said to Elizabeth after receiving the surgeon's report. "If we bundle you well, you should suffer no ill effects from being moved from here to Longbourn." And in short order, Elizabeth found herself placed in the carriage by Mr. Darcy, with blankets tucked around her for warmth. He took her hand before he stepped down from the carriage. "I shall call on you." "I will look forward to it, sir." She smiled at the thought of him calling on her. How differently she felt now from how she had just over a day ago. Without thinking, Darcy lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. Then, reluctantly and with a stammered apology, he exited the carriage to allow Mr. Bennet and Jane to climb in. Chapter 8. 3 days later, when the sun had hidden itself below the horizon, and Longbourn was finally free of the excited chatter of ladies preparing for a ball, Elizabeth settled onto a settee in the sitting-room, propping her still sore leg on a footstool as Mary took a seat in the corner. Mr. Darcy was to call this evening. He had managed to send a note the day after she had left the cottage to inquire after her well-being, but as she was not allowed out of her room until the surgeon gave permission, he had not yet called. A fluttering of nerves danced about in her stomach as she waited for his arrival. Strange as it had seemed, and strange as it had sounded as she admitted it to Jane each day, she had missed his company. "I'm sorry you had to stay with me, Mary." Mary looked up from her book. "I am not. I do not care for balls, you know." "But you dance so well," said Elizabeth. "Dancing well and enjoying the activity are not the same. I do not enjoy it." Mary flipped a page in her book. "I would skip every assembly if Mamma would allow it, but Mamma is desperate to be rid of me." Mary laughed ruefully. Elizabeth wished to contradict her, but she could not. At least, she could not if she wanted to keep a clear conscience. Their mother was anxious about seeing all her daughters married, but she lamented most over Mary. Mary read too much, and was far too serious. These were things which to their mother spelled disaster when it came to finding a husband. "Perhaps you will relax once Jane's engagement has been announced," suggested Elizabeth hopefully. Mary shook her head. "You're engaged, and yet she's been worse these past 3 days." She closed her book. She begged Papa to allow Mr. Collins to call on me, and when Papa would not allow it, she attempted to find reasons to send me to town. In the rain! Mary affected a look of scornful disapproval, and mimicked their mother's sharp tone. "Surely your aunt would keep you if the rainfall became too heavy for you to return. If you bundle up well, you will not get ill. Your father has sent away your only hope." Mary sighed. And so on. You have been fortunate to be confined so much to your room." "I'm sorry," said Elizabeth. "I know how she can be. Remember, she pushed me on Mr. Collins before you." Mary chuckled. "We are not her favourites, are we?" "Indeed we are not." Mrs. Hill stepped into the sitting room. "Mr. Darcy has arrived," she said. "I shall see to the tea straight away." "Please, do not stand," said Mr. Darcy, as Elizabeth made to rise. He nodded his greeting to Mary. "It is good to see you this evening, Miss Mary. I do apologise for your having to miss the ball on my account. I have just assured my sister that it is not something for which you need apologise. I am quite pleased to miss it." "You do not wish to see the finery and mingle with your neighbours?" he asked in surprise. "Did not every young girl wish to attend balls?" "I will admit to being curious about the splendour," she admitted, "but I do not enjoy dancing and find talk of the weather to be rather dull." Darcy chuckled. "I could not agree more. And talk of the weather will be even less exciting this evening. It has only been raining." Mary cleared her throat and spoke in a deep voice. "Did you see the large puddle that formed in front of the blacksmith's? Mud thick enough to pull a shoe off a horse." She changed her pitch slightly. "It is truly dreadful, and I hear that he planned it to be so because it brings him more business." She shook her head. "Foolishness." Darcy continued to chuckle. This was the first time that he'd seen Mary do more than sit silently in a corner or add a comment about why what her younger sisters were doing was inappropriate, often with a verse of scripture attached to the reprimand. This Mary, though still very prim-looking, was much more relaxed. It seemed that there was a second of Elizabeth's sisters whom he would not be averse to having visit. "Is the ball well attended?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, it is very well attended. Bingley begged me to stay for the first set, and I obliged. However, like Miss Mary, I do not enjoy crushes of people, so I came away as quickly as I could." He held up the small leather bag he had brought. "I brought poetry for reading if our conversation should dwindle. I'm not a great conversationalist." He looked to Mary. "Do you like poetry? I could read something else if you prefer." Mary shook her head. "Poetry is lovely, especially those poems about nature or those that tell a story." "Then you're in luck, for I have lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, as well as some sonnets by Shakespeare." "Is it the volume of ballads with the poem about the mariner who kills the bird?" "It is." Mary favoured him with a rare smile. "Well then, if it should come to the point of needing poetry to fill the air instead of silence, I would very much like to hear that tale. However, until then, pay me no heed." "Then it is settled. If needed, I shall read you the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, Miss Mary." She continued to smile as she thanked him before turning back to her book. "How is your leg?" he asked Elizabeth. "It continues to do well," she replied. "The surgeon commented on your work once again today when he was here. I'm certain that if you should wish to give up your estate and take up the profession, he would happily take you on." Darcy chuckled. "I have no aspirations of becoming a surgeon. I only did what was needed. I cannot say I enjoyed the task." He noted how her eyes dropped from looking at him. "Not that I was not thankful to render the service, of course." He grimaced. Conversations in drawing-rooms were never pleasant for him. He would rather sit and observe, but that was not what needed doing. He and Elizabeth needed to discuss their wedding, and though she'd chosen him over her cousin, he was still apprehensive about broaching the subject. "I'm not very good at chatting," he apologised softly. "And so, we must practice," she whispered in return, lifting her eyes to his once again. She had not meant to make him feel uneasy, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her feel decidedly unsettled. In response to her comment, he smiled a genuine smile of pleasure. A small dimple on his right cheek caught her attention and nearly made her drop her gaze again. Those nerves that were merely flutters in her stomach marched up to flutter about her chest, causing her to slow her breathing. "Indeed, we must practice," he agreed. "Would you care to direct me in which direction to turn the conversation? Weather, I am afraid, has already been canvassed." Elizabeth's brows furrowed. "There are music, books, various far-off places, news." She tapped her lip with a finger as she thought of other possible topics of conversation. "Books," said Mary, peeking up from the novel she was reading. "One should always know what a gentleman thinks of books." She placed a ribbon in her book to mark her place. "Take this one, for instance. It is a novel from a circulating library. Do you find it appropriate for a lady to be reading such a thing?" You are reading a novel?" Elizabeth could not conceal her surprise. Mary did not read novels, did she? Mary nodded. Mr. Collins thought it dreadful that a lady should read such a thing, so I decided I must prove him either right or wrong. "And have you?" queried Darcy. He was finding this Mary to be more and more to his liking. "I have, and I believe he is, unsurprisingly, wrong. I have not succumbed to any want of reason for having read it." She shrugged. "It is merely a tangle of intrigues. Any lady with half a mind and a reasonable understanding of propriety must plainly discern it as such. There may even be much to learn about the human condition through careful examination and discussion of the text." "But that is the concern, if there be one with such books," said Darcy. "A lady must own to having the ability to examine, discern, and discuss." Mary nodded her agreement. "Owning to the possession of such skills is not looked on favourably by some, and I fear by condemning the books, rather than exposing them to open discussion, the matter is made more severe, for many a lady will read them in secret and suppose them to be of greater value than they are." "I had not considered it as such, but it is a very good point," replied Darcy. Mary was indeed a surprise this evening. He would certainly look forward to her visits. Mary shrugged. "The real danger comes in not thinking about this or anything else. To believe without questioning is to be blindly led. One must come to her beliefs in a sensible, carefully considered fashion, rather than hopping about as a grasshopper from thing to thing." Elizabeth considered what Mary had said. "Is that why you read the books you do? To verify that what has been said about them is correct?" Mary nodded. "I do. I never believe without proof." Elizabeth felt a pang of reproof at such a statement. Had she adhered to such a philosophy, she might not have listened to Wickham, but for all her love of reasoning, there were times that her emotions overcame her sense. "So the sermons and the scriptures are to prove the parson is not in error?" Mary nodded. "And the various other books are to be able to listen with some understanding to the things spoken of at gatherings. The gentlemen rarely notice my presence, so I have had many opportunities to discern which men are admirable and which are not." Elizabeth blushed. "I must confess I'd not considered why you read sermons to be for that purpose." Indeed, it seemed there was much she had not considered about her sister. "You thought I wished to impress some parson and become his wife?" Mary asked it with a slight laugh in her voice. "You do not wish to marry a parson?" Elizabeth asked. "Most certainly not," declared Mary. "I should have to be pleasant to a great many people that I find loathsome. I would prefer to marry an honest gentleman with a modest income." She rose to pour the tea that had arrived during their discussion. "A small circle of friends, a home and children to teach. That is all I require." "You shall be a credit to whoever is fortunate enough to catch your eye," said Mr. Darcy. "Indeed," agreed Elizabeth, looking carefully at Mr. Darcy. There was a softness about his features again. He was at ease, and with her sister. Mary smiled knowingly as she handed a cup to Darcy. "If a gentleman ever realizes that he has caught my eye—" "Ah, so there is a lucky fellow?" Darcy asked with a raised brow. The tease took Elizabeth by surprise. Mr. Darcy was not only at ease, but he also seemed completely unguarded. She could not keep the pleased smile from her lips. "That I did not say," Mary said coyly, as she handed a cup to her sister. "From the glow of her cheeks, I dare say there is," said Elizabeth with a laugh. "But fret not, I shall not tell mamma or press you to speak more on the subject, unless needed to save you from our cousin." "Oh," said Darcy, taking a sip of his tea, "I was at the ball long enough to hear a story about Mr. Collins." He smiled at the surprised looks that both sisters gave him. "I do not, as a practice, gossip, but your father requested I relay this tale to you, Miss Elizabeth. He thought you would find it quite diverting, and he thought Miss Mary would find it to be a relief. I gathered that your mother is still attempting to match Mr. Collins with one of her daughters." Both nodded and waited eagerly to hear the story. "Mr. Collins has found himself obliged to be engaged," began Darcy, drawing an exclamation of surprise from both Elizabeth and Mary. "A Miss King was hurrying between stores looking for this and that in preparation for tonight's festivities, and in her dashing about in an attempt to procure what she needed and avoid the drops of rain, she darted in front of Mr. Collins, who was busy enlightening Sir William on the elegance of Rosings. Mr. Collins, it seems, is as elegant on his feet as he is in his speech, and before Sir William could put out a hand to stop him, Mr. Collins walked right into Miss King. She stumbled backward into the wall of the milliner's shop. Mr. Collins also stumbled and was unable to stop his forward movement until he was pressed up against the same wall with Miss King as a cushion between him and it. Sir William would have attested to the whole incident being nothing more than an unfortunate accident, but then Mr. Collins, in attempting to extract himself from his present predicament, made it appear worse to those who were passing by the scene. A button on his sleeve caught the edge of her fichu. He smiled and sipped his tea. Mary's eyes grew wide. Was it Mrs. Long and Aunt Phillips who were passing by? Darcy nodded. It seems they did not wait for Sir William's explanation of the situation, and their cries of alarm drew attention. And so Mr. Collins found himself in the somewhat awkward position of asking for the lady's hand, while trying to untangle her fichu from his sleeve. The matter, I understand, was agreeably settled, and Miss King will soon be Mrs. Collins. His smile faded. Their story, however, was not the only one I heard being shared. By my aunt? Asked Elizabeth softly. He nodded. Which brings me to what we need to discuss. He swallowed the last of his tea. Our marriage. He dared not look at her. She had been favourable to him at the cottage, but she had had 3 days to think. Mary rose. I am not needed, she said. It would be better for you to discuss this alone. She gathered the cups and left the room, leaving the door partially open. I am sorry, Darcy began. If there had been any other way for you to receive help... His voice trailed off. You do not wish to marry me. Elizabeth's words cut deeply into her heart as she said them. No, that is not at all what I meant. His response was quick. I did not mean to say that I am sorry to be marrying you. What I am sorry for is having forced you to accept me, for I know that I am not what you wished. He gave her a quick, sad smile before continuing. Before you stumbled into that cottage, I was preparing to leave Netherfield. I told Bingley it was to be with my sister, which was not untrue, but was also not entirely honest. I knew that if I remained here and continued to be in company with you, my heart was in danger of being irrevocably lost to you. He took her hand. I was not wrong. You have my heart. I only hope to one day have yours. Tears stung her eyes. You love me. He nodded again. He had also had 3 days to think and to discuss some of his thoughts with his friend. I do. I have tried not to, but Bingley assures me that my assessments are accurate, and I do love you. He wished to lift her hand to his lips as he had done that day in the carriage, but he did not. That you do not return my affection is understandable. He rose. I believe? We are friends? He looked at her in question. She nodded, and he continued. Friendship is not an unstable foundation for marriage. He looked to her again for confirmation of the fact. I believe ours shall be a good union. We are well matched. His head swayed from side to side as he continued. Perhaps we are not as well matched in standing as some would prefer, but that is of little matter. They shall respect you as I do, or they will be cut from my sphere. You will be my wife, and as such must have a higher priority. He smiled at her. At least that is how I see it. I cannot say that all will agree. While our marriage may be good, life will not be without its difficulties. I have explained to you about my relations. Elizabeth nodded. You have? I have written to them about my choosing to marry. Choosing? She returned his amused smile with an equally impertinent one of her own. I could have allowed Bingley to tend to you, he said, returning to her side. But he loved Jane, she reminded him. Yes, there was that, he admitted, taking her hand again. However, my heart had begun to betray my well-ordered resolve the moment you wandered into the cottage in confusion. It would not have allowed Bingley to tend to you. Even then, though I did not know it, it had decided on you. She shook her head in amazement at his declarations. Part of her wished to return them, but she was not entirely certain that, in doing so, she would be being honest with either herself or him. She knew him to be a good man, the very sort she would wish to marry, and she enjoyed his presence and found herself treasuring the small kind things he did. But an appreciation of character, gratitude, and enjoyment were not love. I have also written to my solicitor, Mr. Darcy continued, and he expects me in town by week's end. Bingley has matters to attend to as well, and we will be leaving on Thursday. What you and I must decide before I leave is when we would like the wedding to take place. I do not wish to wrench you away from family and friends before you are ready. That being said, the longer we wait, the more room we allow for mischief on the part of my Aunt Catherine. He watched her draw in her bottom lip and furrow her brow in thought. You do not have to tell me this instant. Bingley and I will call tomorrow to bid our farewells." Elizabeth swallowed. What was that aching in her chest? And why did tears sting her eyes at the thought of his leaving? "Will you return before the wedding?" He felt her grip tighten on his hand. "That depends, I suppose, on when the wedding's to take place. I know Bingley will be returning, and I would, no doubt, be invited to return with him. I had intended to bring my sister to Netherfield for Christmas, but knowing Wickham is here, I will not require her to come unless she is willing." Elizabeth nodded sadly. She could not, would not, expect him to subject his sister to the presence of Mr. Wickham, nor would she expect him to be absent from his sister at such a time of year. "We will marry by special licence," Mr. Darcy added, "so there is very little to restrict us in time or location. The decision is entirely yours." This time, as he watched her bite her lip and blink rapidly, he did not resist the urge to kiss her hand. "Are you fatigued? Shall I leave?" She shook her head. Her body was weary and her mind troubled, but she could not bring herself to ask him to leave. And so he did not, until after Mary had returned. He had read from each of his books, and Elizabeth's eyes had fluttered closed for the third and final time. Then, with a bow to Mary and whispered farewell to the sleeping Elizabeth, he departed for Netherfield. Chapter 9. "Lizzie," said Jane as she came into Elizabeth's bedroom, "you must take a turn around the garden with me. Mamma is about to drive me to Bedlam between talk of wedding breakfasts and dinner parties." While thanking Mr. Bingley for his excellent ball and bidding him farewell early that morning, Mrs. Bennet had been struck with the notion of hosting a dinner party in honour of her daughters and their beaux, and so an invitation to dine at Longbourn had been made and accepted, and Mrs. Hill had begun overseeing preparations while the weary dancers were still in their beds. Things were well in hand, but even so Mrs. Bennet fluttered about, guaranteeing that all was done to her specifications. And when she was not checking on Mrs. Hill's work, she was wondering aloud about wedding clothes and cakes and pastries. Her daughters' weddings would be an event that all Hertfordshire would remember for some time. Surely no other young lady of their acquaintance would be so well situated. Such rich, handsome men, such connections. Elizabeth had feigned a headache and retired to her room half an hour ago. "The air will help your head," said Jane with a smile. "You do not wish to be indisposed when Mr. Darcy arrives." "As you well know, my head does not hurt. I just do not have your patience." "I have run out of patience, Lizzie. Please, help me or I shall become cross and disagreeable," Jane begged. Elizabeth laughed. "You are nearly incapable of becoming disagreeable, my dear sister." Jane took Elizabeth's pelisse from the wardrobe. "Today I am quite capable. Where is your warm scarf?" There was obviously no answer that Jane would accept aside from a positive one, so Elizabeth donned her coat and wrapped her warm scarf around her neck. Jane was only a moment getting her things, and then the two sisters descended the stairs together. "Where are you going?" called their mother from the sitting room as they passed the open door. "Elizabeth is not to exert herself too much. She's only just recovered from a sore throat." "She's dressed warmly, Mamma." Jane smiled and spoke sweetly, and had it not been for the tightening of her grip on her arm, Elizabeth might have been convinced that Jane's emotions were as peaceful as her expression. "We will not stay out long, and Mr. Shepherd did say that a small amount of exertion would be beneficial. Besides, the air will help Lizzie's headache. You do not wish her to be ill and unable to attend dinner." Her mother's eyes grew wide. No, we must not have that. If she's not there, who will speak to that disagreeable man?" She shuddered slightly. "Why you should choose such a dour man over your cousin, I still do not understand. Mr. Collins was such a friendly man, so talkative and obliging." "Mamma," Jane scolded, "Mr. Darcy is a fine gentleman. There is nothing wrong with being quiet." "But he's so serious." She wrinkled her nose as she said it. "He smiles far too little." "He's very pleasant," said Mary. When her mother turned narrowed eyes towards her, she added, "And he reads very well. You should have heard him reading Shakespeare last night, Mamma." "I'm not interested in your opinion, Mary. If you had gone to town as I had asked, it would not be Mary King that would be mistress in my place one day. It could have been you. At least your sister had sense enough to throw herself at a gentleman of fortune when dashing my hopes. You shall end up an old maid and have to take some horrid governess position, since I shall not have enough to keep both you and me in a proper fashion." "Mamma," Jane scolded once again, "Mary is young, and Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy will be able to place her in the way of many good matches. Mrs. Bennet snuffed at the thought. Kitty and Lydia will be married before Mary. She is so, she wrinkled her nose again, serious. Mary, will you join us? Asked Elizabeth. She could not leave Mary there to suffer more of their mother's disappointment. Elizabeth had endured such lectures enough to know that no one else deserved to bear them. She also knew that without Jane present, Lydia would join her mother in disparagements, and Kitty would cough nervously but say nothing to help. Mary rose. "Oh, I'm certain I cannot spare her. There are things to be made ready," protested Mrs. Bennet. "Things are well in hand, mamma. Besides, if Elizabeth should stumble or suddenly need assistance, I would not be able to both stay with her and seek help." The thought made their mother's eyes grow wide once again. Yes, you're right. If Elizabeth is foolish enough to get a headache on a day such as today, she would be foolish enough to stumble. Mary, go get your things and be quick. You mustn't leave Jane alone with Elizabeth for too long. Jane sighed. "Thank you," mouthed Mary as she slipped past them and hurried up the stairs. "I will ask Mr. Darcy if she can come with us," said Elizabeth as she and Jane left the house. "She and Miss Darcy might become friends, and I would not miss Hertfordshire so much." She looked back at Longbourn. 3 weeks? She asked. Jane nodded as a delighted smile spread across her face. "Unless you care to marry sooner. If, mamma continues as she is, I might insist on travelling to town with Mr. Darcy." She sighed. "Not that I'm in a hurry to marry." "I am happy for you," said Jane softly. "Mr. Darcy is a good man." "I know he is," said Elizabeth. "Then why do you sigh?" "He loves me, Jane." Jane stopped walking and took her sister by the shoulders. "He told you?" Elizabeth nodded. "Last night." "Why did you not tell me when we talked?" Elizabeth could hear the pain in her sister's voice. How did she explain what she did not understand? "Do you love Mr. Bingley?" she asked. "I do." "How do you know?" Elizabeth slipped her arm in Jane's, and they continued walking as Mary joined them. "Do you know how you said you would miss this place?" Elizabeth nodded. Jane sighed. "I will miss it too, but I would miss him more. With him, that is where my heart desires to be." "That is lovely," said Mary as she joined them. Jane smiled at her. "It is more than just that too, but it is hard to explain." The three sisters took a seat on a bench facing the path that led to Longbourn's front door. Elizabeth lapsed into silence. She searched her heart again. How many times had she done so since waking in that cottage? So much of what she had thought to be correct had been proven false. How? Even on a careful examination of her thoughts and feelings, was she to discern them correctly? It was enough to make her head hurt in truth. Had she longer to sit in contemplation, she no doubt would have worked herself into an impressive headache. But she was saved from this unpleasant fate by another equally unpleasant one, the arrival of 3 officers. "Why is he here?" Elizabeth whispered. "He?" asked Mary. "Which he?" "Mr. Wickham," Elizabeth whispered through clenched teeth. How strange it was to see him and feel loathing when only days ago his presence had brought delight. Mary looked at her in concern. "I do not understand. I thought you liked him." "Do you remember what you said about the book you were reading last night?" began Elizabeth, trying to quickly explain her change in opinion, in such a way that, if the officers reached them before she finished, it would not be obvious to them that one of them was the subject of her discussion. "Just like in that book, there are many intrigues. Things may appear one way, but in reality they are another." Mary nodded. "You were right when you said we could discover and discuss much about the human condition with a careful examination of the text." Mary's brow furrowed slightly. "Are you telling me that things are not as they appear?" Elizabeth nodded. "There is partial truth in what is told, but so much that lays hidden." She dared not say any more as the officers were drawing close enough for one of them to have called out a greeting. "Is there danger?" Mary asked in a whisper. Elizabeth shrugged. "I do not know, but possibly." "Ah, Miss Bennet, Miss Elizabeth and Miss Mary, such a beautiful sight to behold upon our arrival." The words slipped like butter from Wickham's smiling lips. He bowed properly, as did his companions, each extending his delight in seeing the ladies. "Your kind mother said that her daughters would not be opposed to a call today," said Captain Denny. "I was unable to extend my congratulations last night." Wickham looked at Jane. "My joy to you and Mr. Bingley. He is a fortunate fellow. Jane blushed, dipped her head, and accepted his wishes. Wickham turned next to Elizabeth. A hint of laughter sparkled in his eyes. "And joy to you as well?" There was a questioning tone to the statement. "Thank you, Mr. Wickham," she answered. "I'm sure I will be quite happy." She motioned toward the house. "My sisters and mother are in the sitting-room. I'm sure they are eager to have your attention." Each gentleman extended an arm to one of the ladies, and so, not wishing to be rude, Elizabeth found herself attached to Wickham. "Your leg is healing?" he asked. "It is. Mr. Shepherd is very good at his profession." "I'd heard it was not Mr. Shepherd who cared for your injury." The statement was made as if it were a comment made about the weather, but the wink which accompanied it gave it a far less innocent tone. Elizabeth swallowed the retort that sprang up unbidden. She would see the man inside and then return to her room where she could be free of both him and her mother. "I had heard it was Mr. Darcy who came to your aid." Another wink and a particular inflection in his tone as he spoke the word aid caused Elizabeth to draw a quick, deep breath. "I was fortunate that he did. I'm not sure I would have survived had he not been willing to do so." "Most certainly," Wickham replied in a very serious tone, though Elizabeth was certain there was a hint of mocking to his words. "I do hope he was gentle in his attentions to your injury." "I'm sure he was." She dropped Wickham's arm. Wickham snatched at her elbow, catching a small bit of the fabric of her jacket. "My apologies, Miss Elizabeth. I meant nothing untoward." "Did you not?" She pulled her sleeve from his grasp and folded her arms. "Come now, Miss Elizabeth. Do you not find humour in your being attached to such a man? Did you not tell me what you thought of him? Can we not laugh a bit at fate? I may have spoken amiss." "Truly? Has he convinced you of his worth, then?" "I had not thought him capable of being able to speak so persuasively, but perhaps it was not his words that convinced you." Wickham's lips curled slightly in disgust. "Lizzie," Jane called from the door. "I will be with you in a moment," Elizabeth answered. "I cannot enter without you," said Jane. Elizabeth was unsure if Jane was worried about how their mother would react to Elizabeth being left outside alone in her injured state, or if she was worried to leave Elizabeth with Wickham. Elizabeth had shared with Jane much of what Darcy had told her about Wickham, holding back only the portion about Miss Darcy. "It seems we must go in," Elizabeth said to Wickham. Then she turned and joined her sister at the door. "Are you well?" Jane whispered. Elizabeth nodded, although she did not feel particularly well. "Oh, Mr. Wickham," Mrs. Bennet cried as he entered behind Jane and Elizabeth. "It is a pleasure to see you. I was so disappointed not to have your excellent company last night at the ball, but one must be understanding of duty to His Majesty." "The pleasure is all mine." Wickham bowed over her hand as she tittered in delight. "Do come in and be seated." She waved him away in a flustered but pleased fashion. "Lizzie," she said, turning to her daughters, "you will join us. Your head can simply not hurt with such pleasant company. The good Lord knows you will have little of that once you are married." "Mamma," said Jane. "Do not scold me," her mother replied. "You shall be happy with Mr. Bingley. He's so agreeable, but," she sighed, "your sister has not chosen so well." Jane took her mother by the arm and drew her further into the passage, so that their words could not be heard by the occupants of the room. "Mr. Darcy is of greater consequence than Mr. Bingley. How can you say Lizzie has not chosen well?" "Oh, she will have pin money and fine carriages and servants, but she will miss the pleasantries of good conversation. Mr. Darcy is not so agreeable as Mr. Bingley." "I find him perfectly agreeable," said Elizabeth. Her mother raised her brows and looked at Elizabeth in disbelief. "I did not always," Elizabeth admitted, "but I have come to know him better, and he is agreeable. Quite agreeable," she added with some force as her mother shook her head. Mrs. Bennet gave a dismissive wave. "Believe what you will, but put your things away and join us." Elizabeth did as requested. She put her things away, and then after a few moments of quiet in her room, she entered the sitting-room just as her mother was proposing the idea of the officers staying for dinner. "Unfortunately, we cannot stay," said Denny. "Colonel Forrester expects us to dine with him." Mrs. Bennet sighed heavily with disappointment, while Elizabeth sighed in relief. "Such a pity," her mother said dejectedly. "Gatherings are far more entertaining when there is a large crowd. But no matter, there will be other evenings. Colonel Forrester will just have to be persuaded to forego your company for at least one of them." Denny agreed, and the topic shifted, at Lydia's request, to some bit of trivial news about the drills that were required of them. Elizabeth took a seat near Mary and Jane, a distance apart from their mother and other sisters. Mary opened her book and began reading, while Jane passed a piece of needlework to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was just beginning to relax, despite the constant chatter and exclamations of delight from her younger sister, when Wickham decided to leave the talkative group and insert himself into her solitude. "We shall be leaving soon," he said as he took a seat next to her. She smiled and nodded, wishing with all her might that he might go away at that moment. "I must apologise for my words earlier. They were indelicate." Again she nodded but said nothing. She did not wish to engage him in conversation if it could be helped. "It seems Darcy is always to have everything of value," Wickham said softly. "I, on the other hand, must always be poor. I had hoped you and I might be friends, or—" He did not complete the statement, but drew out the last word meaningfully. "You have a great many friends, Mr. Wickham. I am certain you will only feel the removal of my presence for a few moments before another will replace me. A man of such easy manners as yourself must never be in want of friends." Elizabeth would not comment on whether they be true friends or just companions of the moment and the means to an end, though she might think on that later. She smiled as brightly at him as she could, while at the same time continuing to wish him gone. "I must admit that you seem far more pleased to be tied to Darcy than I would expect. It surprises me." Elizabeth laughed. "It should not be surprising. Did you not say he could please where he wished?" She saw her mother cast a critical glance her direction, so she leaned closer to Wickham to make it appear as if they were indeed having a most cosy conversation. "He is not what I thought, nor is he exactly as you described." She leaned back. "He improves on acquaintance, and when one takes the time to understand him." Wickham gave her an inquisitive look. "We spoke of you, the law, the church, and of his father and his sister," she smiled, as Wickham's look shifted from curiosity to one of unease. "I find I have come to know him, and you, quite well in the process." She smiled again, in case her mother was watching, and because seeing Wickham squirm slightly in his chair was rather satisfying. Darcy stood just outside the sitting room at Longbourn, waiting with Mr. Bingley to be announced. Why was she smiling at that man, and why was she sitting so confoundedly close to him? She laughed and leaned closer to the man. Feeling as if he had had the air knocked out of his lungs, Darcy took a step back. "I will return," he whispered to Bingley. "I've forgotten something." He took his hat and coat back from Mr. Hill and swiftly left the house. As Bingley was announced, Wickham's face became solemn and slightly strained. Elizabeth looked from him to the door expectantly. Excitement caused her heart to flutter as she looked for the man she'd been wishing to see since that morning. Wishing to see? She looked at Jane, whose face shone with pleasure at seeing Bingley. Was this the feeling of which Jane spoke in the garden when she was explaining how she knew she loved Mr. Bingley? She turned her eyes back to the empty doorway, and her heart, which had just that moment been light and joyous knowing that Darcy had arrived, sank. She rose to greet Bingley. "Is Mr. Darcy not with you?" she asked softly. "He told me that he would return. He forgot something." He leaned a bit closer to her. "He rarely forgets things," he whispered, and tipped his head ever so slightly toward Mr. Wickham, who had relinquished his seat and was standing nervously next to Denny. "However, he's probably not gone far," Bingley continued. "I expect he's merely walking off his jealousy in the garden." "Jealousy?" Elizabeth whispered in surprise. She looked at Wickham and then Bingley. "Of Mr. Wickham?" She thought about how her conversation might have appeared. Indeed, how she had wished it to appear both to her mother and Wickham. Oh dear! That was for my mother, so she would not berate me for being impolite. She pressed her hand firmly against her chest. Why did her heart feel as if it were about to shatter into thousands of pieces? "Go and tell him that you love him," Jane whispered as she gave Elizabeth a small push toward the door. "I will make your excuses to Mamma." Elizabeth hurried from the room. She could hear her mother's shrill voice and then Jane's quiet, soothing one. Mr. Hill opened the door for her. "He's gone to the left of the house," he said as she stood on the step looking around. She thanked him and wrapped her shawl more closely around her shoulders as she descended the steps. The garden to the left of the house was not visible to the sitting room, which she suspected was why he had gone there. He would be able to see when Wickham left without Wickham knowing he was there. She rounded the side of the house and nearly collided with him. Darcy had been pacing the short path near the entrance to the side garden, cursing himself and Wickham under his breath. He reached out a hand to catch her as she stumbled. "You have no coat or hat. I was afraid you would leave, and I would not get to see you." He searched her face. You wished to see me?" She smiled and nodded. "I missed you," she said softly. A smile graced his lips for a brief moment. "You looked happy." He looked past her toward the house. His heart still ached at seeing her smiling at Wickham. "I assure you, I have not been happy all day until this moment." She stepped closer to him as if drawn by some unseen force. "My mother has been unbearable. She still does not fully approve of you." She smiled at how he drew his eyebrows together in question at that statement. It was not arrogance for a man of his means to expect a mother to welcome him with open arms. Most mothers would, but her mother was not like most. "She claims you're too serious and do not smile enough," she explained. His eyes grew wide in surprise, and she might have chuckled if she were not thinking about the other trying person she had encountered today. "And then Mr. Wickham called." She blew out a breath and shook her head. "I could not allow my mother to see me being anything but pleasant, and so I smiled when I would have rather scowled. But I believe, after our short conversation, he understands now that my opinion of you has changed." Relief swept through him, and his smile returned. "I should not have listened to him before and would not now, knowing you and him as I now do," she added. She needed him to know that he had nothing to fear from Wickham. She tried to pull her wrap a bit more snugly. The air was seeping through its thin layer, and she was beginning to feel chilled, but she would not return to the warmth of the house until he knew her heart. "You're shivering." He rubbed her arms from shoulder to elbow in an attempt to warm her. "You should go in." He did not wish her to leave him, but he could not selfishly keep her here when doing so might cause her harm. She shook her head. "I cannot." "You'll become ill." There was something deliciously sweet in his chiding, concerned tone as it wrapped itself around her heart. How had she been so blind to what she wanted, to what she truly felt? "I will not sit in the house with that man when the man I wish with all my heart to be with stands in the garden, thinking I care for another." A tear slid down her cheek. "Come," he said softly. He pulled her towards him, opened his coat and wrapped her inside it. "I love you," she said as she lay her head against his heart. "I think I have for some time, but I did not know it until you did not arrive with Mr. Bingley." She peeked up at him and smiled shyly. "The sitting room is crowded and noisy, and yet to me it felt empty, and all I could hear was my heart's cry. For you." He pulled in a deep breath and released it slowly, feeling the peace that he so prized returning and deepening, grasping his heart and mind as if it would never be shaken or removed so long as she was at his side. She loved him. They stood silently for several minutes, one clinging to the other, neither willing to part as the November sun steadily slid its way toward the horizon, and the breeze deepened its chill. Finally, when steps were heard moving along the drive and away from the house, Darcy spoke. "I believe the sitting room is no longer so crowded as it once was. We should go in." Reluctantly, Elizabeth agreed and moved out of his embrace, feeling the cold of the air replacing his warmth. "However, before we go in," Darcy said, "I must have your answer as to when we should marry. Bingley suggested 3 weeks, and then we could stay at Netherfield until after 12th night. But what about Georgiana? Bingley pointed out that my cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who is her other guardian, could see her well protected even in Hertfordshire." He wrapped her in his embrace again in an effort to protect her from the cold and stop her shivering. "We must get you indoors," he said as he rubbed her back. 3 weeks would be— She counted out the days on her fingers. December 18th? Yes, a week before Christmas. He placed his right hand on her cheek, causing her to look up at him. "Will that be acceptable? Will you marry me in 3 weeks?" "Will you be gone all that time?" "Not unless you wish it, and even then it may prove an impossible feat." His thumb brushed along her cheek. To his delight, a smile spread across her face. "In that case, Mr. Darcy, with a happy heart I shall marry you in 3 weeks." His left hand cupped her other cheek. "I love you, Elizabeth Bennet," he said. And then, without allowing her to return the sentiment, he kissed her, and the coolness of the late afternoon air, as well as the last vestiges of uncertainty regarding the feelings of one for the other, faded, leaving in its place a new dawning, an awakening to the life and love that lay before them. This has been Waking to Mr. Darcy, a Dash of Darcy and Companions collection, Book 2, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, a cloned voice made available by the voice actor through the 11 Labs library. The 2016 copyright for Waking to Mr. Darcy is held by Leanie Brown. All rights reserved.